We are at the end of the semester here. I want to give you guys props, first of all, for obviously making it through this class, because this class is not an easy one. And now we're at the end of the semester, we're at the last lecture. We are at the home stretch. So we just got to get through today. We got to get through finals next week, and then we are set for summer. And hopefully you guys don't got to deal with any summer classes, over the summer. But if you do, hey, at least you get a little break. Okay, so today, actually, before we start, let me go ahead and do a couple quick announcements again. I think I got everybody's career essay. So I'll be grading those over the next few days, and I will be sending you guys some feedback on it over the course of between probably tomorrow and Tuesday at the absolute latest. But I'm glad you got the career essays in. I'm really excited to read all of those, because those always are really fun for me to read every year. So that's that. So that will be coming up. And then you should see your updated grades, hopefully by the end of the weekend, if I can get through everything. That's number one. Number two is, I guess all we have left is finals. So we're obviously gonna have a lab today. So lab 22 will be today. And then next week we will have our final exams. So the final, just to kind of recap one last time, there's going to be 100 questions. It's going to be worth 200 points. 200 points total. There's going to be a total of 100 questions. The first 50 are going to be coming from chapters 22, 24, 25, and 26. And 26 we'll be covering today. Then numbers 51 through 90 will be from the previous exams in some form or fashion. So like I said, if we have a free response question on a previous exam, I may find a way to make it into a multiple choice question on the final. Okay? So be studying everything, be comfortable with everything, because everything is fair game at this point. Okay? And then questions 91 through 100. Those ones will be organ identification questions. So I'll show you an organ. You literally just tell me what that organ is. And then for an extra point of extra credit, you tell me the function of that, one function of that organ. Okay. And that is it. So those ones, the final I expect to have graded by sometime Thursday afternoon, Thursday evening, latest by Friday of next week. But I'm gonna try to get it done as soon as I possibly can, so you guys can have that information for you. Okay. Am I forgetting? I think that's everything. Okay. Any questions on what's coming up?
So with respect to the lab 21 and 22, did you want them turned in by tonight or by Friday?
Turn them in by Friday at the latest. Yeah, turn them in by Friday at the absolute latest.
Okay, so yeah. 21 and 22, correct?
Correct, yeah, so 21 and 22.
Okay.
Cool. Last thing. So we'll also have a review session. This is not mandatory, you don't need to come to it, it's just optional if you have any questions that you want to clarify. That will be on Monday. At our normal class time at 5 o'clock. I'll be sending out a Zoom invitation for that, just like normal. So if you have any questions, just bring them. I'm not preparing anything, so whatever questions you have, we can just go right into it and then answer any questions that you have from there. Cool.
Cool. So the exam's going to be posted on the
questions on what's coming.
The exam's going to be posted on 21st, correct? In the
yes.
morning. And
yeah. Actually, thank you for bringing that up. So that will be on. Yeah, so this will be Wednesday, it should be the 21st, right? Wednesday the 20th.
Yeah, 20.
Wednesday the 20th.
Yes.
Yeah. So this will be Wednesday the 20th. And again, that'll be from 8 o'clock in the morning to 11:59 p.m. So again, if there's any issues with any pictures not showing up, I will most likely be at my computer all day. So I'll be able to answer those as quickly as possible.
I did forget to
Okay.
mention.
Hopefully it doesn't happen, but if it does, it's happened pretty much every other test. So I'm just kind of expecting it to happen with at least one of the pictures.
I forgot to mention to you that the last homework, when I first went on, I could see one of the diagrams. It was actually the diagram of the hypothalamus and the anterior and posterior pituitary. And the second time I went on, I couldn't see the diagram. I don't know if other students told you.
Oh.
Yeah. From the last
Okay.
time.
I figured that probably happens to some people. Yeah, I figured that probably happens to some people. I don't know why that happens. And so that's just kind of one of those things where you just kind of got to roll with the punches. Or if something does not show up, just email me and then I'll show you what that picture is. Okay. And then, I can kind of clarify it and make it a little easier on you that way. So if a picture doesn't show up, just like I said, just email me whatever that picture is so you can see it.
Okay, no problem. Thank you.
All right, cool. No problem. All right. Any other questions?
No.
Okay. Okay, cool. So remember, there is not going to be any homework for this week. There is a practice assignment sheet up on Canvas for chapters 25 and 26. So again, that one's not going to be due. It's not going to be worth any points, but that's just for you to have an idea of what you should be comfortable with from these last two chapters on the final. So go through that as you're studying, and that'll kind of help you kind of guide your studying there too.
Okay.
Okay. All right. So that is that. All righty. So without further ado, we're going to get into our last chapter here, which is the reproductive system. Okay. So this is a series of systems that is a little bit complicated. We're going to be taking a look at both the male and the female reproductive systems. The male one isn't as complicated. There's a lot of details to it, but it's pretty relatively straightforward, I think. So we're going to be looking at the scrotum, we're going to be looking at the testes and the structures within it, and we're going to be looking at how the sperm is going to get matured, and then the anatomy of the penis too. So we're going to start with the male reproductive system, and then we're going to get into the female reproductive system. That one is a little bit more complicated, and so we'll take our time as we go through that. So we'll take a look at the ovaries. We'll look at the processes that sit inside the ovaries in terms of how women are going to be able to produce the oocytes or the eggs. We'll look at the fallopian tubes, the uterus, the vagina, the vulva, the mammary glands. And the last thing that we'll do is we'll look at what happens during all the stages of the female reproductive cycle. The entire 28-day cycle that is going to be kind of, that we know obviously women are going to be really familiar with. So that's going to be our game plan today. We're going to start with the males and then kind of dive into the female reproductive system. So obviously we know this is a system that is going to help us to produce some offspring. And in order to produce, a live human, okay, there's going to be a lot of steps to it. And these steps are not going to be very easy. These are going to be very complicated steps. So like I said, if you guys have any questions, feel free to stop me and we can kind of clarify, what's happening at these different locations at different stages. Okay. So like I said, this does get complicated, so do not hesitate to stop me if you're confused. Okay. That's the game plan. So today we're going to be looking at the sperm and the oocyte. So those are the gametes. The egg is also called the oocyte as well. So these are the gametes. Okay, so the gametes are the cells that will be used to help produce a zygote or help you produce a future baby here. Okay, and so the gametes are going to be the sperm cells in males, and then the egg cells or the oocytes in females. Okay. So those gametes are going to come together through a process called fertilization. And as they go through fertilization, they're going to end up forming a zygote. Okay? So a lot of the stuff we're going to be talking about is going to be kind of familiar from when we looked at chapter 4, but then we're going to be kind of building on a lot of that stuff as well too. Okay? So those are the gametes. Okay? Gametes, sperm cells, and the egg cells. Now those gametes that we're producing are going to be produced by some reproductive organs called the gonads. Okay? In males, the testes are going to be the gonads, and they're going to be producing the sperm. In females, the female gonads are the ovaries. Okay, so the ovaries will be producing and holding the oocytes. Okay. So in addition to the gametes and the gonads, there's also going to be some accessory sex glands. And so these accessory sex glands are going to be these individual structures that are going to help to protect the gametes and help move them throughout the reproductive tract. Okay? Those are the accessory sex glands, and we'll look at those later on today as well. Okay? Number 4 is we're going to have our supporting structures. So the supporting structures in this case would be the penis and the vagina, and they're going to assist with the delivery of the gametes, the sperm and the egg, from point A to point B. And so all of this is ultimately going to help us form the babies, okay, our embryo or a fetus. And the fetus is eventually going to start growing inside the uterus. So those are all the really important structures that we're going to be seeing here. And just like any other system, there can be some things that go wrong. And so the branch of medicine that has to deal with the female reproductive system is called gynecology. And that's associated with any diseases or any treatments or any kind of studies that are going on within the female reproductive tract. That's the GYN part of the OBGYN. And then the last one is andrology, which is the branch of medicine that has to deal with male disorders in terms of infertility and sexual dysfunction and things like that. Okay, that's what we're taking a look at here. Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to start off with the male reproductive system. And this system does look a little complicated, but it is relatively kind of sort of straightforward here. And so obviously we're going to be taking a look at the testes. We're going to be looking at the various tubes that are going to allow the sperm to move. And then we're going to look at the urethra and the penis that is going to help to deliver the sperm into the female reproductive system. Okay. So that is our game plan. This is what it would look like in the cadaver. Okay, so again, you can kind of see the bladder here. You can see the penis and testes down below, and so on and so forth. Okay. So we're going to be taking a look at all these different structures, and we're going to start with the scrotum. Okay. And so the scrotum is a kind of a layer of skin that's going to hang below the root of the penis. And it is going to essentially hold the testes, below the penis. Okay. The scrotum is going to have a septum, kind of a wall in the middle of it. Okay. And that septum, the scrotal septum here, is going to separate the scrotum into 2 sacs. Okay. And each sac is going to contain one of the testes. Okay. So here's one testis here, and then the other testis over here. Now, in addition to that, the scrotum is also going to have some muscles in it. Okay. The muscles are called the dartos muscle, which is made up of smooth muscle. And so the dartos muscle is down here. Okay. So this one is made up of smooth muscle. And then we also have another muscle called the cremaster muscle. Okay. So the cremaster muscle runs along the sides of the testes, and these are made up of skeletal muscle. Okay. Now, the scrotum doesn't really get a whole lot of appreciation, but it actually serves a very, very important role in terms of sperm production. Okay? And so the role of the scrotum is to help monitor the temperature inside the testes. Okay? And so it's going to kind of help regulate the temperature inside the testes. And so the reason for that is because for normal or appropriate sperm production, the sperm needs to be at a temperature of about 2 to 3 degrees Celsius below your normal body temperature. And so the scrotum, the muscles, specifically the muscles inside the scrotum, are going to be able to kind of help regulate that by either pulling the scrotum and the testes closer up towards the body or further away from the body. Okay. So if we're in a cold environment, then what's going to happen is the cremaster and the dartos muscles are both going to contract. And as they contract, they're going to pull the testes closer to the core body temperature to warm them up and make sure that the testes are at an appropriate temperature to produce healthy sperm. The flip side of that is if it gets too warm outside or too warm on our core body temperature, then what the muscles will do is they'll relax. And as they relax, they're going to pull the testes away from the core body temperature. And that's going to help to cool the testes and again, bring them back to the appropriate temperature to help produce healthy sperm. Okay, so that's the scrotum. Okay. Any questions on kind of the scrotum's function here?
No.
Okay, cool. Okay, so inside the scrotum, we're going to have 2 testes. Okay, so one testes on the left and the one testes on the right. And again, each one is going to be inside its own individual scrotal sac. And so these are the paired glands that are going to be producing the sperm. Okay, so on the outside of the testes is going to be a layer of connective tissue called the tunica albuginea. So the tunica albuginea is just a dense, dense fibrous capsule. And the tunica albuginea is going to kind of give this testis some shape. Okay, now the other thing that the tunica albuginea does is it's going to kind of dive inward inside the testes. And as it dives a little bit inward, it's going to create some walls and kind of some individual lobules inside the testes. Okay. And I'll show you a picture on the next slide. But essentially, the tunica albuginea will divide the testes into 200 to 300 lobules internally. Okay. So this is what it looks like here. Okay. So again, here you have the tunica albuginea. Okay. And so the tunica albuginea, like I said, is going to dive inward, dive internally, and it's going to form these individual lobules here. So here's one lobule, here's another one, third one, and so on and so forth. Okay. So we're going to be forming about 200 to 300 lobules from the tunica albuginea as it dives into the interior portions of the testes. Okay. Now, in each of those lobules is anywhere from 1 to 3 of these very tightly coiled tubes called these seminiferous tubules. Okay. So the seminiferous tubules are these guys here. Okay. So these tubules inside each of the lobules. The seminiferous tubules are important because this specifically is going to be where the sperm will be produced. Okay. So sperm is going to be produced inside these seminiferous tubules. Okay. And so the process of producing sperm is called spermatogenesis. Okay. And so spermatogenesis, like I said, is going to be taking place inside the seminiferous tubules. Okay. So in order to produce sperm, what we're going to need are some excuse me, some spermatogenic cells. Okay. And so these spermatogenic cells are going to be the cells that will eventually produce sperm. Okay. So we're going to have some spermatogonia. The spermatogonia are going to then develop into primary spermatocytes. The primary spermatocytes will then develop into secondary spermatocytes. The secondary spermatocytes will then develop into spermatids, and then from there, the spermatids will become full, mature sperm cells. Okay. Okay, so all those are going to get produced from these spermatogenic cells. Okay, spermatogenic cells are going to make the spermatogonia, and then they'll develop into sperm cells from there. Okay. Okay, so inside the testes, specifically inside these seminiferous tubules, there's going to be these cells here called Sertoli cells. Okay? And so these Sertoli cells make up the walls of these seminiferous tubules, and their job is to support spermatogenesis and help this process work effectively and efficiently. Okay? So these Sertoli cells are also called sustentacular cells. These Sertoli cells are going to be really important for a number of different functions. Okay, number one is they're going to be able to provide lots of nutrients to the spermatocytes, the spermatids, and the sperm that get produced. Okay? So all of those different cells are going to need lots of nutrients in order to keep themselves alive, and those nutrients are going to come from some fluid that gets produced from these Sertoli cells, okay, which we see over here. Okay. The other thing that the Sertoli cells will do is they'll phagocytize any extra cytoplasm inside the spermatids. Okay. So before spermatids become full-fledged sperm, the spermatids have lots of cytoplasm in them. There's almost really too much cytoplasm in them. And so what the Sertoli cells will do is they'll basically go in and just remove the excess cytoplasm, kind of drain it from the cells, from the spermatids, and that's going to help it to become a fully formed sperm cell. Number three is it's going to be able to produce some fluid, and the Sertoli cells will produce that fluid that will help to kind of move the spermatogenic cells from the walls of the seminiferous tubule and ultimately into the lumen of the seminiferous tubule. Okay. So that's going to assist with the movement of the spermatogenic cells from the wall to the lumen, and then move them into the lumen, and then again, be able to push them out of the lumen as well. Okay. That's going to assist with the sperm transport. Okay. The next function is that the Sertoli cells are going to be able to produce a hormone called inhibin. Okay, so if you remember from last Tuesday when we were looking at the endocrine system, inhibin is a hormone that is able to decrease the FSH production. Okay? It's going to inhibit FSH. And so what FSH does is it stimulates spermatogenesis. Okay? So if spermatogenesis is happening too fast or we have enough sperm cells, then this inhibin is going to get produced to kind of reduce the rate of spermatogenesis and keep us at an appropriate level of sperm cells. And so, like I said, that's going to be able to regulate the FSH levels. And then Sertoli cells are also going to help to regulate testosterone too. Okay. So these Sertoli cells are doing a wide range of functions, from nourishing the sperm to moving the sperm to getting rid of excess cytoplasm, and then to producing its own individual hormones and regulating the effects of other hormones. Okay. So these Sertoli cells are really, really important. The next type of cell that we're going to see inside the seminiferous, or I guess kind of in between the seminiferous tubules, are these Leydig cells, okay, or also called interstitial cells. And so these Leydig cells are going to sit in between adjacent seminiferous tubules. So here's one, here's another seminiferous tubule. And so all of these Leydig cells here are going to be found in between adjacent seminiferous tubules. And their role is to produce testosterone. Okay? And so testosterone is going to be important in males because that's going to help to regulate the libido or the sex drive. And then the testosterone can also help to stimulate the production of the natural kind of masculine characteristics, like growing of the beard, deepening of the voice, facial hair, pubic hair, and things like that, okay? Muscle mass, etc. So these are going to be produced inside the Leydig cells. Okay, so those are all within the testes. Okay. Any questions on what's going on inside the testes so far before we kind of get into spermatogenesis? Okay, all right, so now that we're in spermatogenesis, the next thing that's going to end up happening is we're going to start producing our sperm. Okay, so again, this is going to be taking place inside the seminiferous tubules. Okay, so it's going to happen, and this is going to happen over the course of about 2 to 2.5 months in order to kind of get spermatogenesis to go to completion. What's going to happen is you're going to start off with a spermatogonium. Okay, the spermatogonium here is going to undergo mitosis, and then as it undergoes mitosis, it's going to eventually form a primary spermatocyte, which we see over here. Okay. So at this point, the primary spermatocyte is considered diploid, so it has 46 chromosomes, okay, 2 sets of chromosomes here, total of 46 chromosomes. And then this primary spermatocyte is going to undergo meiosis. Okay. So it's going to start by undergoing meiosis 1, and as it undergoes meiosis 1, it's going to form 2 secondary spermatocytes. Okay. So we go from 1 primary spermatocyte into 2 secondary spermatocytes. Okay. Each of these spermatocytes now has 1 set of chromosomes. Okay. They each have 23 chromosomes apiece. Okay. You initially have 2 sets with in the primary spermatocyte. You divide, you put 1 set in 1 secondary spermatocyte and the other set in the other secondary spermatocyte. Okay, so each one has a total of 23 chromosomes. Okay. From there, the secondary spermatocytes are going to undergo meiosis 2. And as they undergo meiosis 2, we're going to form a total of 4 spermatids. Okay, so these spermatids again have extra cytoplasm in them. They're going to get the extra cytoplasm is going to get phagocytized out by the Sertoli cells, and they're going to eventually mature into sperm cells. Okay, fully mature sperm cells through a process called spermiogenesis. Okay. Now, kind of an interesting thing to keep in mind here is that during this process, about half of the sperm cells are going to contain X chromosomes, and the other half are going to contain Y chromosomes. Okay, and so let me kind of do a quick little drawing here. So if you look at males, males are going to have 1 X chromosome and then 1 Y chromosome. Okay, so as they undergo meiosis, they're eventually going to be producing some sperm cells here. So here's one, actually, let me just draw it over here. So they can actually send an X chromosome into a sperm cell, or they can send a Y chromosome into a sperm cell. Okay. I'll put X here, and then Y over here. Okay. Now, when it comes to the females always carry 2 X chromosomes, so the eggs that she produces will always have an X in them, okay, an X chromosome. Okay. And so when fertilization takes place, okay, a sperm cell that contains an X chromosome might fertilize an egg that also contains an X chromosome, where we're going to end up producing offspring that have 2 X chromosomes. Let me put this in a different color. Okay. So if these 2 join together, you're going to end up forming an offspring with 2 X chromosomes, and that is going to be how we end up with daughters. Okay. In the case of the one that has a Y chromosome, if we have a Y chromosome here, okay, we have a sperm cell that contains a Y chromosome that joins up with an egg cell, okay, then we're going to have an offspring with an X and a Y chromosome, and that's how we end up with males. Okay, so really, when it comes to determining the sex of your baby, okay, the male really is the one who determines that. Okay. It depends on whether he passes down an X chromosome from in his sperm or a Y chromosome in his sperm. If he sends an X chromosome through his sperm and joins up with the egg, you end up forming a daughter. If you ever get a Y sperm, joins with the X, you end up getting a son. Okay. So for all those scenarios where, you know, kings and whatnot have been really frustrated at the wives for not giving them sons, it was really their fault. Okay. It was just the guys were not sending the correct chromosomes or the you know, ideal quote unquote chromosomes for their lineage. But that's typically how we end up with sons and daughters. Okay. All right, a little interesting tidbit there. Okay, anywho, so that is spermatogenesis. Any questions on this process here?
Yeah, I have a quick question, George.
Yeah, go ahead.
It was a quick off-topic one, but does that ever change for men, like the carrying of the chromosome? Like, you know, you said sometimes they carry X or Y. Does it change over time?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah, that
Say
was
that
it.
last part again.
Oh, okay. I said, does it ever change like over time, like with kind of like the man like carrying an X or a Y chromosome? Oh, could you hear?
So are you saying, like, is it possible for him to like only send sperm with X chromosomes, for example?
Yeah, or to change, or can it change? Yeah.
It doesn't really change. It doesn't really change, and the reason for that is because all of the spermatogenic cells, they all contain both the kind of the X and Y chromosomes, and so when they go through this process here, they're always going to be sending, or always going to be. Let me say it differently. They're always going to be producing sperm that have an X and a Y or a Y chromosome. It's always going to be half and half. There's never going to be a scenario where you have, like, for example, 3 or 4 sperm cells that all have X chromosomes, and then like 1 or none that have Y. It's always going to be half and half. And then it's just a matter of which sperm is the one that ends up fertilizing the egg.
Okay.
Yeah. Good question. Any other questions here? Okay. So that is that. So this is what this whole process would look like inside the seminiferous tubules. Okay. So we'll start off with the spermatogonium, kind of at the most superficial walls of the seminiferous tubule. Okay. And as they start to undergo this process, this spermatogenic process, they're going to start to move further and further, closer and closer to the lumen. Okay. By the time they reach the lumen, okay, they've eventually formed fully fledged sperm cells here. Okay, so that is the process there. And again, that's going to be, that movement is going to be regulated by the Sertoli cells inside the seminiferous tubule. Cool. Okay, so that's that. Okay, so now as we take a look at, whoops, sorry, wrong button, my bad. Here we go. Okay. So, is everyone able to see the PowerPoint again?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Now we can.
Okay.
Yeah.
I know we can.
Okay. Okay, sorry about that. I clicked the wrong button. My apologies. Okay, so now we're taking a look at these sperm cells. Okay. So the sperm cells that get produced here are what have kind of 3 major regions to them. And I think we looked at these a little bit in chapter 4. Okay. The first region is the head. Okay. And so the head is going to be this region over here, this kind of more anterior region of the sperm cell. This is going to be where the nucleus of the sperm cell is going to be found. Okay, remember, these nuclei are going to be haploid, so they're only going to contain 1 set of 23 chromosomes. Okay. So 23 chromosomes here. Okay. Surrounding the head is a structure called the acrosome. And so the acrosome is almost like a little vesicle that's going to contain lots of these digestive enzymes. And again, digestive enzymes in terms of being able to digest their way into the oocyte in order to allow fertilization to take place, to penetrate the oocyte. Okay. And so that's typically going to cover the anterior portion of the head. And then obviously when the sperm meets up with the oocyte, it's going to release those enzymes to kind of help it bury a hole inside the oocyte and then allow the sperm to enter and cause fertilization to occur from there. And the last region is the tail. Okay. So the tail is going to make up the majority of the sperm cell here. And it gets divided up into 4 regions. Okay, the first part is the neck region. And so the neck region is just going to be this little constricted region that contains lots of centrioles. And those centrioles will form the microtubules that will make up the rest of the tail. Okay. Then from there, we have a middle piece. Okay. And the middle piece will contain all the mitochondria that are going to be producing lots of ATP. And that is going to help provide energy for the sperm cell to move. Okay, that's going to allow locomotion by whipping the tail back and forth. Okay. Then we have the principal piece, which is the longest portion of the tail, and then the end piece, which is this last portion of the tail. Okay, that's the sperm cell. Okay, so remember, all of those sperm cells are going to be produced here inside the seminiferous tubules. Okay. So the Sertoli cells are going to continue to produce their fluid, and as they produce that fluid, that's going to push those sperm cells into the lumen of the seminiferous tubules, and then from there, it's going to push this, those sperm cells into a region called the ductus epididymis, or this very long, very thick kind of duct here called the ductus epididymis. Okay. The epididymis is it's kind of a curved kind of tube on the back portion of the testes. So it's on the posterior and superior region of the testis. And inside the epididymis, there's going to be lots of these structures called stereocilia. Okay. So these stereocilia are these kind of like microvilli, and what they do is they increase the surface area, and that is going to allow reabsorption of any sperm that have degenerated at that point. Okay. And we'll talk about that in a second, a little bit more. So they're moving from the seminiferous tubule into the ductus epididymis, and that's going to be making up part of the epididymis here. Okay. Okay, so here is the epididymis. And so the epididymis is a really important structure because this is going to be the place where sperm becomes mature. Okay, this is where sperm maturation is going to be taking place. And so this maturation process is going to allow the sperm to develop the motility ability, its ability to move, as well as its ability to fertilize the egg and fertilize the ovum. Okay. So that's all going to be taking place inside the epididymis here. Okay. Now the epididymis, in addition to allowing sperm maturation, it's also going to allow the storage of sperm for long periods of time. Okay. So it's going to be able to store the sperm, and then when the male is sexually aroused, that is going to help to propel the sperm, okay, from the epididymis into the vas deferens and out through the rest of the body using peristalsis. And we'll talk more about that later. Okay. But this is going to be one of the places where the sperm can be stored and then ejected or ejaculated out of. Okay. Now, any sperm that is not ejaculated out of this portion after a few months, after this region, sorry, let me say that again. If the sperm is not ejaculated out of the epididymis after several months, then the sperm will become phagocytized and then eventually become reabsorbed and kind of recycled, essentially, at this point. Okay. So this is kind of one of those, if you don't use it, you lose it scenarios. Okay. If the sperm doesn't get ejaculated out of here, it's eventually going to get reabsorbed and phagocytized and then replaced with some new sperm cells. Okay. All right, so that's the epididymis. So this is what the epididymis kind of would look like, and again, it's going to be sitting on the posterior and superior portion of the testes. Okay. Now, at the tail end of the epididymis, which is going to be here at the bottom, the epididymis is going to become a little less coiled, and it's going to increase in size. Okay. At that point, it's going to kind of widen up, and as it widens up, it eventually will become the vas deferens, or also called the ductus deferens. Okay. So the ductus deferens, the vas deferens, is this very, very long tube that's going to run from the tail of the epididymis superiorly. It's going to kind of loop backwards around one of the ureters, and then eventually will open up at the ampulla, okay, which is right over here. Okay. And we'll talk about what that does in a second here. Okay. But as you can see, it's a very, very long tube inside the male reproductive system. Okay. So the vas deferens is another location where the sperm can be ejaculated from. Okay. So the vas deferens can store the sperm for long periods of time, usually for several months, and then if it gets ejaculated out, it's going to move through the vas deferens and eventually into this ampulla, which will lead into the urethra and then eventually out of the body from there. Okay. That's number one. Now, if the sperm does not get ejaculated out of the vas deferens after that period of months, the same thing is going to happen as what happened in the epididymis. Okay, it's eventually going to get phagocytized and then reabsorbed, and then now the sperm is gone, and eventually will get replaced with some new sperm cells. Cool. Okay, so that's the vas deferens. Okay, we take a look at the vas deferens over here. We obviously see it's going to enlarge at the ampulla. Okay, so this is the vas deferens here. Okay, it's going to enlarge at the ampulla. Okay? And then the ampulla of the vas deferens will also join up with the seminal vesicle, which we'll talk about in a little bit, okay, to form a structure called the ejaculatory duct. Okay? So these two structures will come together and fuse to form the ejaculatory duct. Okay? And so the ejaculatory duct is going to be on the superior and posterior surface of the prostate gland, and it's going to run inferiorly, okay, into the urethra. Okay, so here's the ejaculatory duct, and then if we kind of look at it from this view, again, here we see our seminal vesicle, we see the ampulla of the vas deferens. They're going to join together to form the ejaculatory duct here. Okay? And then this ejaculatory duct will eventually join up with the prostatic urethra. Okay? And that is going to be the first place where the sperm is eventually going to begin its exit out of the body from. Okay. Okay. Any questions so far on any of these tubes? I know there's kind of a lot of tubes with a lot of different names here. Any questions so far?
No.
No. Okay. All right. So that's all going to lead into the urethra. Okay. Now, when we reach the male urethra, like we saw on Monday, the male urethra is a pretty long tube. Okay, it's much longer than the female urethra, but it is also going to be kind of a shared exit point for both urine as well as semen. Okay. And so when we look at the prostatic urethra, there's going to be three regions to it. The first one is the prostatic urethra, which we see right here, and that's going to pass through the prostate. Okay. Then from there, the urethra is going to pass more inferiorly into the perineum, and that is going to be referred to as the intermediate urethra or the membranous urethra. Okay. And then from there, the urethra will then enter the penis, and this will now become the spongy urethra or the penile urethra. And so the spongy urethra passes through a structure in the penis called the corpus spongiosum. And we'll look at that later too as well. Okay. So that's going to be the last tube that the semen is going to be exiting out of the body from. Okay. And then eventually it's going to exit out of the penis through a hole in the tip called the external urethral orifice. Okay. So those are the three regions. We got the prostatic urethra, then we have the intermediate urethra, and then from there the spongy urethra. Okay. And then out of the body through the external urethral orifice. Okay, that's the urethra. Okay, so now that leads us to this particular operation called a vasectomy. Okay, and so a vasectomy is almost like a type of male birth control, or essentially kind of male sterilization. And so what happens during a vasectomy is if a male no longer wants to have any more babies, what he can do is he can go into the doctor or go see a urologist. And so what they'll do is he'll tell the doctor, hey, I'm ready for a vasectomy. I want to get snipped. I don't want any more babies. Okay. So what the surgeon will do is they'll go in, they'll make a little incision inside the side of the scrotum. Okay. They will remove a portion of the vas deferens, which we see over here. They're going to remove it altogether and then tie the two ends of the vas deferens. Okay. So here's one end of the vas deferens that's been tied together. Here's another end that's been tied together. And you do that with both sides. Okay. And so by doing this, the male is still able to produce sperm. Okay. He's still able to produce sperm, but the sperm has no way of getting out. Okay. And so what happens here is you just produce the sperm. If the ejaculation were to take place, the sperm would pretty much go through the epididymis, and then it would have reached this end of the vas deferens, and then just stop here. Okay, it's going to have nowhere else to go. Okay. And so because it has nowhere else to go, it's eventually just going to get degenerated and then destroyed by phagocytosis. Okay. So that way, there's no sperm that's able to get out through the penis, and then as a result, there will be no way for him to have any more babies. Okay. Now, this procedure is relatively safe because there's no blood vessels that get cut. And so because there's no blood vessels that get cut, the testosterone levels are going to stay intact. So it's not going to have any effect on the sexual desire or the libido. It's not going to have any desire or any effect on performance or ejaculation. Everything else is still going to work exactly as it should. The only thing that won't happen is you will not have any sperm cells exiting out of the penis during ejaculation. Okay. That's what happens during a vasectomy. Any questions on vasectomies? Okay. All right, cool. That's a vasectomy. That's typically how they work. Okay. So that leads us into this next kind of topic here. This is the semen. Okay. And so a lot of times people will use sperm and semen interchangeably, okay, which isn't technically correct. Okay. Sperm just refers to the sperm cells themselves, while the semen refers to the sperm as well as the seminal fluid that the sperm is kind of captured in, okay, or that it's going to be flowing in. Okay. So that's going to be the seminal fluid. Okay. So when we look at semen, semen is going to have a slightly alkaline pH, and there's going to be a reason for that. Okay. The reason it has a kind of a more alkaline pH is it's going to kind of protect the sperm cells from the acidic environments inside the male urethra as well as within the female vagina. Okay. So by having an alkaline pH, that's going to help to balance out the acidity of those two areas and keep the sperm cells alive. Okay. In addition to that, the semen is also going to provide a way for transportation for the sperm to help it to move throughout the male reproductive tract and then into the female reproductive tract as well. It's going to be able to provide some nourishment and then, like I said, some protection from the acidic environment that it may that the sperm cells may come into contact with, or that they will come into contact with, not may. Cool. Okay, so we're going to take a look at the different glands that are going to be important to help produce the semen. And so the first one, these are going to be collectively known as the accessory sex glands. Okay? So the accessory sex glands are these series of glands here that are going to secrete the majority of the seminal fluid. Okay, so those accessory sex glands are going to start with the seminal vesicle, then we have the prostate, and then the bulbourethral glands down beneath it. Okay. So we're going to start with the seminal vesicles, and so the seminal vesicles are going to be here on the posterior side of the bladder, and they're going to be producing some seminal fluid that is pretty alkaline. Okay, it's going to have a higher pH. And that higher pH is going to essentially neutralize the acidic environment inside the urethra as well as the female reproductive tract. So it's going to kind of protect the sperm cells from being in contact with any acidic environments. In addition to that, it's also going to be producing some fructose. And so the fructose helps the cells to be able to produce some ATP. And again, the ATP will then help with the locomotion of the sperm, as well as producing some prostaglandins, which help with the motility and the viability of the sperm, kind of keeping it alive. Okay. And so of these, of the total seminal fluid, okay, the seminal vesicles will account for about 60% of the semen itself. Okay, so they make up the large portion of the seminal fluid. Okay, so these are our seminal vesicles here. All right, so then the next one is the prostate gland. And so the prostate gland is this kind of donut-shaped gland that sits up underneath the bladder, and it also contains the prostatic urethra, okay. So which we see right here. So this is the prostatic urethra. Okay. And so what happens in the prostate is it's going to be producing kind of a more acidic fluid, a very slightly acidic fluid that's going to contain some citric acid, and that citric acid will again help with ATP production to kind of help the sperm be able to move. Okay. That's the prostate. Okay, which we see down here. Okay. And then the last ones are the bulbourethral glands, which are these two kind of P-shaped glands, or P-sized glands here, that are inferior to the prostate, and they're going to sit on either side of the membranous urethra. Okay. And so the fluid that gets produced from the bulbourethral glands is also going to be alkaline, and again, that's going to help to kind of neutralize the acidity within the urine, or sorry, within the urinary tract, okay, from any like trace levels of urine. And then it's also going to be able to produce some mucus. Okay? And so that mucus is going to kind of make its way to the tip of the penis during sexual arousal. And that's going to kind of lubricate the penis. And then it's also going to also kind of lubricate the urethra as well, so that when contraction does happen to propel the sperm through the penis and through the urethra, it doesn't damage the sperm. So it's going to kind of protect the sperm during the peristalsis processes that could potentially damage the sperm. Okay. So it's going to ensure that the sperm stay nice and intact during ejaculation. Okay. So those are the three glands. We have the seminal glands, we have or seminal vesicles, we have the prostate gland, and then the bulbourethral glands. Okay. So all of these are going to be producing the seminal fluid, okay, that are going to be traveling with the sperm itself, and together the seminal fluid produced by these glands with the sperm cells forms what we know as the semen. Okay. All right. Any questions so far?
No.
No.
Okay. Okay. So, with that being said, there is a condition that has to do with one of these accessory glands, and that is specifically going to be the prostate. Okay. And so, one of the most common, or not the most common, but the leading cause of death in cancer for males is prostate cancer. Okay. And so, typically, when when you got a male, the prostate should only really be about the size of a donut. It really shouldn't be that big. Okay. However, in someone who is dealing with prostate cancer, the prostate enlarges significantly. Okay. And so when it enlarges, it actually clamps down on the internal and external urethral sphincters. Okay. And so by clamping down on them, it closes up the urethra. Okay. And so any urine that you would want to try to pee out is not going to have a way to get out because its exit route has been clamped shut, okay, by the enlarged urethra. And so people who are dealing with prostate cancer or like prostatitis or anything like that, one of the things that they'll first kind of notice is that they'll have difficulty with urination. And this is the reason why. It's going to be the enlarged prostate kind of clamps down on the urethra here. Okay. And so one way that we're able to detect prostate cancer is with a blood test that can test for prostate-specific antigen, or PSA. And so if someone has PSA, or elevated levels of PSA, I should say, that is an indication that someone has an enlarged prostate. And then from there, the urologist can kind of go in and try to figure out what exactly the scenario is. If they're dealing with prostatitis, if they're dealing with prostate cancer, or whatever it may be, they kind of go in and figure out what the problem is. Okay. And so because this is such a significant cause of death in terms of cancer for males, men should be kind of taking an annual digital rectal exam pretty much every year by the time they turn 40 to test to see if they have an enlarged prostate, okay, which, as you can probably imagine, is not fun. So that's prostate cancer. Okay. Any questions on prostate cancer or anything that has to do with the prostate? No.
Do they actually remove the prostate itself?
Oh yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, that was my question. Do they actually remove the prostate?
The prostate can be removed.
Uh-huh.
In some cases, they can. It's not it kind of depends on where you're at in life. So if you're in a scenario where like you're still young and you still want to have kids, they ideally would not want to remove the prostate. However, if you're kind of older and you're not planning on having any more kids anyway, then yeah, you can remove the prostate because it's not really going to have an effect on you having kids because you don't want any more kids at that point. So it can be removed, but it depends on also kind of where you're at in life too. If you want kids, ideally you probably don't want this removed. There are some scenarios where you can remove a portion of the prostate, but it also depends on where that cancer has developed. If that cancer is making up the majority of the prostate, then yeah, you might just want to eliminate the entire prostate too. But if, for example, that prostate cancer or that tumor is just on a single portion, then maybe just remove that one part, and that doesn't really significantly affect your ability to have kids down the road too. So it's kind of one of those that you kind of take it from the scenario that person is in, and kind of go from there. But it can be removed if need be.
And
Cool. Good question.
is it always that when you have an enlarged prostate, does it have to be cancer or it can be something else?
So no, it doesn't necessarily have to be cancer. So Sherry's question was, if someone is dealing with an enlarged prostate, is it always cancer? And the answer is no. So it isn't always cancer. It can just be prostatitis, where you just have an inflamed prostate. And so if someone has prostatitis, again, the same thing kind of happens. The prostate enlarges, but it's not cancer itself. Okay, so it kind of creates a little bit of a scenario there. Yeah. Any other questions with that?
Does it just get like? Does it?
So, oh yeah, what?
Oh yeah, I was gonna ask you though. Does the prostate just kind of develop cancer on its own because someone ages, or is it because someone's lifestyle, or how does that go about?
No, I don't think there's a clear answer to that. So Elijah's question is, does the enlarged prostate kind of happen because of some reason? Not necessarily. Sometimes it can happen just on its own, just like any other cancer shows up. It sometimes can be due to like an infection in the prostate. So for example, if you encountered some bacteria that made its way into the prostate, that can cause some inflammation there and cause the prostate to swell too. Let's see. Yeah, so it could be for a number of reasons. It doesn't necessarily, it isn't necessarily one main reason, but it can happen for a number of different types of reasons too.
Okay.
Okay, cool. And then I got another question that was, for someone who has a vasectomy, obviously they would cut their, this is kind of on a separate but kind of similar note. So if you kind of go back here, to look at all these glands. So if someone has a vasectomy, they're obviously not going to be able to produce any sperm. Okay, but during ejaculation, okay, that the cut in the vas deferens doesn't affect the ability of the prostate, the bulbourethral glands, or the seminal vesicles. So basically, whenever ejaculation happens in someone who has had a vasectomy, they're just releasing the semen, the seminal fluid itself, okay, not the sperm cells within it. Okay. So the sperm obviously is not going to be present there, but the seminal fluid will be what comes out of the penis through ejaculation. Any other questions? Okay. All right, so that is going to lead us to kind of the last major portion of the male reproductive system, which is the penis. And so the penis is going to be the passageway, like I said, for both semen as well as urine. And so both of those fluids are going to be exiting out through the same passageway. So the penis is going to have kind of a major body of it. And so the body of the penis is going to be made up of 3 cylindrical masses. Okay? And each of those masses is going to be surrounded by its own tunica albuginea, just like the same thing we saw with the testes. Okay? And so the body of the penis is going to be made up of 2 corpora cavernosa. So this would be one corpus cavernosum on one side. The other one would have another corpus cavernosum over here. Okay. That's what we see here. Okay. And then the third of those masses is the corpus spongiosum, okay, which is more medial. Okay. So the corpus spongiosum is going to contain the spongy urethra, and it's going to keep that urethra open in order to allow ejaculation to take place and allow the sperm to exit out. Okay. So when we look at those 3 masses, okay, both corpora cavernosa and the corpus spongiosum, all 3 of those masses are going to contain erectile tissue with lots of blood vessels within them, okay, and lots of smooth muscle as well. And then at the tip of the penis, we're going to have what's called the glans penis. And so the glans penis is kind of enlarged region of the penis here. And that is going to be at the distal end of the the corpus spongiosum. Okay. At the end of the glans penis, there's going to be the opening, which is the external urethral orifice. And again, that's going to be where the semen and the urine exit out of the body from. Okay. So that is the penis there. Okay. So, and again, if you were to take a look at the penis in a kind of a diagram here, if you were to kind of cut through the penis, you would see the 3 masses. Here you have the 2 corpora cavernosum, which are on the kind of top dorsolateral sides of the penis, and then the one down below is the corpus spongiosum. And again, inside the corpus spongiosum, you're going to have the spongy urethra. Okay. Now, all 3 of these, like I said, are going to have this erectile tissue as well as some blood vessels in them. And so we'll take a look at where that comes into play right now. Okay. So when we take a look at the penis, obviously in order to have the sperm exit out of the penis, okay, the first thing that needs to happen is when the male needs to have an erection. Okay. And so the erection is going to be stimulated by these parasympathetic nerve fibers that are going to run from the spinal cord down to the smooth muscle of the penis. And so what's going to happen here is those smooth muscle fibers are going to be releasing a neurotransmitter called nitric oxide, or NO. Okay. So what nitric oxide does is it causes relaxation of the smooth muscle, okay, specifically of the arterioles within the within those bodies, okay, within those three masses there. Okay. So the arteries are going to start to dilate, and as they dilate, that's going to cause extra blood flow. And as you have extra blood flow, the smooth muscle inside the erectile tissue is also going to relax and expand as well. And that is going to cause the penis to kind of be erect here. Okay. So that's what we see here. Okay. So we have these blood vessels that are initially pretty narrow, okay, but as the erection takes place, you have the smooth muscle fibers that are going to trigger the relaxation of the smooth muscle of the blood vessels and cause it to dilate and fill with blood, as well as the relaxation of the relaxation and the expansion of those masses, the corpora cavernosa and the corpora spongiosum. Okay. So that's all going to be regulated by parasympathetic fibers. Okay. Now, once ejaculation takes place, okay, then the fibers are going to switch. So instead of being stimulated by parasympathetic fibers, it's now going to be stimulated by sympathetic fibers. Okay. And so this sympathetic reflex is going to cause constrictions or contractions of the smooth muscle sphincters around the bladder, as well as throughout the male reproductive system. Okay, those contractions. These contractions are going to cause the vas deferens to contract, and it's also going to cause all the accessory sex glands to also contract. And in doing so, it's going to produce, or it's going to cause the sperm and the seminal fluid to all be propelled outward. Okay? They're going to join together and then eventually make their way out of the penis through the external urethral orifice. Okay, so that is how ejaculation takes place. It switches from parasympathetic to sympathetic fibers. And once that happens, then the peristaltic contractions within the vas deferens are going to contract, as well as the accessory sex glands, and you're basically going to propel the sperm and the seminal fluid out of the body through the spongy urethra and then through the external urethral orifice. Cool. All right, any questions on this process here? What can I answer? No? Okay, cool. All right, so that is the penis. Okay. And so again, this is what it would look like in a cadaver. And again, you can see the corpora cavernosa over here, and then the corpora spongiosum here. And again, right down the middle of the corpus spongiosum, you have the spongy urethra. Okay, so this is going to be where the sperm and the urine is going to be exiting the body out of, okay? Specifically from here. Okay, so that's it for the male reproductive system. So quick question here. So which of the following is the correct pathway for sperm during ejaculation? Okay. I'll go ahead and let you guys take a look at that and let me know what you guys think.
C.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's either C or D, but yeah, C probably.
And C.
Yes, C is correct, right. So it's going to go from the epididymis, okay, which is going to be where it's going to get stored. It's going to move into the vas deferens, move into the ejaculatory duct, and then from the ejaculatory duct, it's going to move into the urethra from
Urethra.
there. Okay. Next question. So in the figure shown, what structure is indicated here? Okay, are we looking at the seminal vesicle, the ejaculatory duct, the bulbourethral gland, the vas deferens, or the prostate?
That's easy. That's prostate.
Yeah, that's the prostate.
That is indeed the prostate.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. That's the prostate. And so again, you can tell because it's going to sit up underneath the bladder. Okay. Now, actually, let's go ahead and kind of go through the rest of these. So these two structures here, what are these? These two guys here.
Seminal vesicles.
Seminal vesicles.
Right. The seminal vesicles. Perfect. Good. And then these two guys down here.
Bulbourethra.
Right. These will be the bulbourethral glands. Perfect. All right. Good. Okay. Any questions on the male reproductive system? That's pretty much it for the male reproductive system. Relatively straightforward. You know, not a whole lot of crazy details going on here. Any questions here before we go forward?
No,
Okay.
pretty straightforward.
Okay. So now that is going to lead us into the female reproductive system. So now we're going to switch gears here, and we're going to look at a system that is a little bit more complicated. Here's all the structures here. And so obviously we can see the bladder. Sitting on top of the bladder, we're going to find the uterus. Here we have the vagina. We have the clitoris down here. We have the ovaries. And so we're going to be taking a look at all of these different structures and the functions that all of these structures are going to be kind of producing during the course of the female reproductive, or over the female reproductive tract. Okay. And so this is what it would look like in a cadaver. So again, here you'd see the bladder, and then again on top you would find the uterus, yeah, and then the vagina, and so on and so forth. Okay. So the first one that we're going to start with is the ovaries. Okay. And so the ovaries, just like the testes, are these two kind of paired glands here, and these are going to serve as the gonads. Okay. So these are going to be where the oocytes, or the woman's eggs, are going to be produced here. Okay. The ovaries, the second part isn't really as, not necessarily as important, but the ovaries essentially get attached to the uterus by a ligament called the ovarian ligament, which is down here. And then the suspensory ligaments just attach the ovaries to the pelvic wall. Okay, you don't need to worry too much about that, but just know the ovaries are kind of held in place within the pelvic cavity. Okay. And so these are going to be the gonads. These are going to be where we're going to find our oocytes and where they're going to be maturing. Okay. When we take a look at the histology of the ovaries are going to have what's called the ovarian mesothelium. And that's going to be the outer portion that it's going to line the outside of the surface of the ovaries. Okay. So it's just a layer of simple epithelium here. Okay. On the kind of on the deeper portions, just kind of on the inside region of the ovarian mesothelium, we're going to find the tunica albuginea again. So we've seen three places where we've seen the tunica albuginea. Okay. So the tunica albuginea is again going to be this very dense, whitish capsule that's going to coat kind of the inside portion of the ovarian mesothelium, and again, kind of give the ovaries a little bit of shape here. Okay. That is the tunica albuginea. Okay. Now, just deep to the tunica albuginea, we are going to have the region known as the ovarian cortex, okay? The outer region of the ovaries. Okay. So the ovarian cortex is going to be the location where the ovarian follicles are going to begin to develop, okay? And where they're going to go through various stages of their development and go through the maturation process. Okay? So here we have some primordial follicles, some primary follicles. We're eventually going to have a primary follicle develop into a secondary follicle, and the secondary follicle will eventually develop into a mature follicle. Okay? So during the kind of the follicular development process, at first we're going to have multiple follicles all being stimulated and all being kind of developing at one point. Eventually, there's going to come to a point where only one of the follicles is going to get stimulated the most, and that follicle will eventually become the primary follicle, the secondary follicle, and then become eventually the mature follicle. Okay, so I'll talk about that a little bit more as we go forward here. So the mature follicle is also called the Graafian follicle, and so this is a pretty large follicle here that's going to contain lots of fluid, and it's ready to rupture. When it ruptures, it's going to release the oocyte, okay, the secondary oocyte, into the fallopian tubes. And that's going to be where ovulation actually occurs. Okay? So ovulation is specifically going to be the rupturing of this mature follicle to release, the secondary oocyte into the fallopian tubes. Okay. And again, all that's going to be happening inside the ovarian cortex. Okay. Now, when the Graafian follicle undergoes ovulation, it'll eventually begin to collapse in on itself. And as it collapses on itself, it's going to form a structure called the corpus luteum. Okay. So the corpus luteum is going to be the remnants of the mature follicle after ovulation, and it's going to produce a number of hormones. Okay. It's going to be able to produce progesterone, estrogen, relaxin, and inhibin. Okay. So all of these are going to be released from the corpus luteum inside the ovaries. Okay. All right, so that's the ovarian cortex. Okay. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take a look at oogenesis. So before we looked at spermatogenesis, and here we're going to take a look at oogenesis, how the oocytes are going to be produced inside the ovaries. Okay. Now, contrary to spermatogenesis, oogenesis is a process that's going to produce all your oocytes, but that's all going to happen before you're born. Okay. In spermatogenesis, the males are able to produce sperm from the time they're born, basically throughout the rest of their life. Okay. In the case of females, the oocytes are only going to be produced before they're born. Okay. At the time they're born, they already have all of the oocytes that they're ever going to have. Okay. So that's the one thing that's really important to keep in mind here. They're not going to be producing any more oocytes throughout their lifespan. Whatever they're born with is whatever they're going to have at that point, and that's all they're ever going to have. Okay. So this is a process that begins in utero, okay, while you're developing in your mom's womb. Okay. And so before birth takes place, the zygote is going to start undergoing meiosis, and meiosis is going to begin, or let me say that differently. Some of the germ cells inside the ovaries are going to start undergoing meiosis, and they're going to produce the oocytes, okay, as they undergo maturation. So we're going to take a look at this process here. Okay. And so it's all going to start with these cells called primordial germ cells. Okay. And so when you're a fetus developing in mama's womb, okay, for ladies at least, the primordial germ cells are going to start to move from the yolk sac into the ovaries. Okay. Once they develop into the, or once they make their way into the ovaries, they're going to develop into these cells called oogonia. And these oogonia are going to be able to produce millions of cells called germ cells. Okay, some of these germ cells are eventually going to develop into the primary oocytes. Okay, now before birth, the majority of those germ cells are going to degenerate. Okay, the vast majority of them are going to degenerate. They're never going to see the light of day through a process called atresia. Okay, so they're all going to get destroyed. But there are going to be a few kind of survivors of this process. Okay? And so the surviving germ cells, the ones that are not undergoing atresia, the ones that do remain here, will eventually develop into the primary oocytes. Okay. This is making sense so far. Okay. This is going to get a little bit complicated as we go forward here. Okay.
Yeah.
So again, let me know if there's any questions as we go here. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. So starting with the primary oocytes. Once we form our primary oocytes, or once women form their primary oocytes, the primary oocyte is going to begin meiosis 1. Okay. Once it begins meiosis 1, it's going to stop midway through it. Okay. It's going to stop midway through meiosis 1. It's not going to complete it just yet. Okay. And so it's going to get arrested in meiosis 1. Once it gets arrested in meiosis 1, right in the middle of meiosis 1, it's going to start getting surrounded by all these cells called follicular cells. So this layer of flat cells surrounding the primary oocyte, okay, these cells are known as our follicular cells. Okay. Okay. And so these follicular cells here, these ones here, will surround the primary oocyte. And so this entire structure is now referred to as a primordial follicle. Okay. And so here's our primary oocyte surrounded by these follicular cells, the single layer of follicular cells here. Okay. That's our primordial follicle. So every single primary oocyte is going to be captured inside a surviving primary oocyte is going to be captured inside a primordial follicle. Okay. Now, by the time the woman is born, okay, she's going to have anywhere from 200,000 to 2 million primary oocytes inside the ovaries. Okay. Now, over the period from her birth to puberty, okay, some of those primary oocytes are going to start to undergo atresia. Some of those are going to end up getting wiped out and degenerated. Okay. By the time she hits puberty, she's only going to have about 40,000 left. Okay, 40,000 primary oocytes are going to be left here. Okay. Of those 40,000 that are remaining at puberty, only about 1% of them, so about 400 of those primary oocytes, will eventually mature and then ovulate, okay, or undergo ovulation, I should say. Okay, during the woman's reproductive kind of lifetime. Like I said, the remainder of those primary oocytes, the other thousands of primary oocytes, are going to end up getting degraded through atresia. Okay. So this is our primary follicle. Okay. So once we form the primary follicle, and again, this is going to be happening pretty much from the time you're born, from the time the woman is born to the time she hits puberty. Okay. Each primordial follicle every month is going to get stimulated by FSH and LH, follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. That's kind of where follicle stimulating hormone gets its name. Okay? So follicle stimulating hormone, FSH, as well as LH are going to be stimulating the oocytes, sorry, the primordial follicles. Okay? So as FSH and LH stimulate the primordial follicles, eventually one of those follicles, or one of a group of follicles, is going to receive the most stimulation, and it will be the only one that will become a primary follicle. Okay? So from here, now we form our primary follicle after it's been stimulated by FSH and LH. This primary follicle is going to start to form a glycoprotein layer around the oocyte called the zona pellucida. Okay, this we saw earlier back in chapter 4 at the beginning of the semester. Okay? So we have the zona pellucida surrounding it, surrounding our primary oocyte. And then in addition to that, we're also going to have a bunch of cells that are going to come in between the zona pellucida and the oocyte, and kind of its boundary here. Okay, and these cells are going to be called the granulosa cells. Okay? So these granulosa cells are going to come in between the zona pellucida and the follicular cells, okay, which are out the surface here. Okay. Okay. So all we've done here is we've taken our primordial follicle. It's undergone stimulation from FSH and LH. Okay? One of those primordial follicles eventually gets the most stimulation and becomes a primary follicle. Okay? Once we form that primary follicle, we form the zona pellucida, and then we start to accumulate a bunch of cells called granulosa cells. And these granulosa cells will surround the oocyte and the zona pellucida. From there, what's going to happen is the secondary follicle, or sorry, the primary follicle is going to continue being stimulated by FSH. Okay? And so as that happens, the granulosa cells are going to start producing a fluid called, the granulosa, sorry, let me backtrack. I got ahead of myself. So it continues to get stimulated. Okay? Our primary follicle continues to get stimulated. Okay? As it continues to get stimulated, it will eventually become a secondary follicle. Okay? Once it becomes a secondary follicle, those granulosa cells are going to start producing what's called a follicular fluid. Okay? That follicular fluid is going to create a little bit of a cavity inside the secondary follicle. That cavity is called the antrum, and so that's going to be one way that we're able to designate or determine that we're looking at a secondary follicle and not a primary follicle. And we're going to see this antrum here. Okay? So that's what we see here. Okay? In addition to that, the other thing that's going to happen is the innermost layer of those granulosa cells is going to surround the zona pellucida, okay? Surround the zona pellucida and attach to it, and it's going to be referred to as the corona radiata. Okay, again, that should sound familiar from chapter 4. Okay. So we have the zona pellucida, and then around the zona pellucida you have the corona radiata. Okay, okay, so that's that. Okay. So again, the secondary follicle is going to continue to be stimulated by FSH and LH, and as it does that, it will eventually become a Graafian follicle or a mature follicle. Okay? And so the way you can tell a mature follicle is you're going to see this antrum that has enlarged significantly, and it's going to make up the majority of the mature follicle. Cool. Okay. Any questions on the development of these follicles here? No. Okay. So again, starting with the primary oocyte, inside of it, the primary oocyte is going to be surrounded by these follicular cells. Okay, it's going to undergo stimulation from FSH and LH and become a primary follicle. Okay. This primary follicle is going to start to form the zona pellucida, and the granulosa cells are going to start to develop around it as well. Okay. It's going to continue to get stimulated by FSH and LH. We're going to see the antrum begin to develop here. It becomes a secondary follicle. And then we start to form the corona radiata from those granulosa cells. And then the last thing is it's going to eventually become a mature follicle or a Graafian follicle. Okay. And so now this Graafian follicle is now close to being prepared for ovulation, but not quite yet. All right, was there a question?
Yes. So if there's any disconnect between the hormones, can it prevent the maturity of the egg in someone?
Yes. Yes, absolutely. So Sharon's question is, if there's some kind of disconnect between FSH and LH, right, between these two hormones, can this create a problem here? And yes, that will actually absolutely create a problem. Because if you're not producing enough FSH, or if the follicles are not receptive enough to the FSH, then they're not going to be able to develop properly. Okay, and if they don't develop properly, it's going to be a lot harder to get to this process here, to the mature follicle. And if you can't get to the mature follicle, you're going to have a very hard time ovulating. Okay? And if you have a very hard time ovulating, that's going to create a more difficult time with having kids. Okay? So it's going to kind of hit at multiple steps if there's a problem with not receiving FSH and LH from the anterior pituitary. Okay?
Yeah, I have
Very good question.
I have a friend who had a disconnect between these hormones, and she can have kids. She's almost 40
Yes.
now. She's having a problem, and she was told it's a disconnect.
Yeah.
These hormones. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And so that can definitely happen, and we'll see kind of where that kind of plays into a role kind of more towards the end of today too. So there's several steps where there's going to be a problem if you have a disconnect at the FSH level, or the FSH or the LH level. Yeah, really good question. Good. Okay, any other questions here?
Not right now.
Okay. All right, so now that we formed the mature follicle, okay, again, the mature follicle still just has a primary oocyte in it. Okay? So now we're now ready for ovulation to take place. Okay. So right before ovulation happens, the primary oocyte, which had already stopped meiosis 1, is going to start to complete it. Okay. So it kind of arrested in the middle of meiosis 1 previously, before developing into the follicles. Okay. When ovulation is ready, okay, it's going to complete meiosis. Okay. Once it completes meiosis 1, okay, it's going to end up producing 2 cells of different sizes. Okay. The first one is going to be the first polar body. Okay, the first polar body just has a bunch of any discarded or any like unnecessary genetic material. Nothing really ends up coming of the first polar body. Okay, that one eventually gets destroyed and nothing happens to that. So what's more important here is that this process also forms the secondary oocyte. Okay. So this secondary oocyte is going to be formed here at the end of meiosis 1. Okay. Once the secondary oocyte gets produced, it's going to begin meiosis 2, but again, it's going to stop in the middle at metaphase. Okay. So once it stops at metaphase, of this process here, okay, it's going to begin meiosis 2, it's going to stop. Okay. Once it stops, that's going to signal to the mature follicle to rupture, okay, and release that secondary oocyte into the fallopian tubes. Okay. And so that is going to be where ovulation takes place. Okay. So the mature follicle is going to rupture, it's going to ovulate, it's going to release that secondary oocyte into the fallopian tubes, and then now we can have a couple different things happening here. Okay. So the secondary follicle is going to get released into the peritoneal cavity and then eventually into the fallopian tubes, along with all the cells around it, including the zona pellucida, the corona radiata, and the first polar body. Okay. All that stuff is going to get pushed into the fallopian tubes during the ovulation process. Okay. Now, if fertilization does not occur, right? If there's no sperm in the fallopian tubes to fertilize the secondary oocyte, okay, that oocyte is just going to degenerate. It's going to get reabsorbed, and then it's going to be done. Okay. However, if fertilization does take place, right? If we have a sperm that is present here inside the fallopian tubes, it is going to penetrate into the secondary oocyte. Okay. So we're going to have fertilization occur. It's going to penetrate the secondary oocyte. Once the sperm cell penetrates into the secondary oocyte and begins fertilization, the secondary oocyte will finish meiosis 2. Okay. And then as it finishes meiosis 2, it's going to end up forming a second polar body, which again, nothing will come of that. It will eventually get degraded. But more importantly, it's going to form the ovum. Okay. And so the ovum, along with the sperm, okay, there's going to be 2 sets of DNA in there. As their DNA joins together, that is going to be the fertilization process where we're able to form a zygote here. Okay. So just to kind of recap this whole process, and this is one that I do want you to be comfortable with for the exam too. Okay. What's going to happen here is we're going to have this primary oocyte. Okay. The primary oocyte, when ovulation is ready to take place, is going to finish meiosis 1. When it finishes meiosis 1, it's going to produce a first polar body, which gets degraded later, and then a secondary oocyte. the secondary oocyte will then begin meiosis 2, okay, but then it'll stop in the middle of it. Okay. When it arrests in meiosis 2, it is going to trigger the ovulation process to take place. Okay. And so the secondary oocyte is going to get released from its mature follicle into the fallopian tubes, and then one of two things is going to happen. Okay. Option A, fertilization does not take place, and in that case, the cells just degrade and degenerate. Okay. If fertilization does take place, then what will happen is the secondary oocyte will undergo fertilization. It'll complete meiosis 2. Okay. Once it completes meiosis 2, it will then develop into a second polar body, which again will get degraded, and then into an ovum. Okay. The DNA from the ovum, the chromosomes within the ovum, and the chromosomes from the sperm are going to join together. Okay. The nuclei are going to fuse and unite, and then we're going to end up forming a diploid zygote. Okay. And that zygote will eventually become our baby. Okay. Any processes or any questions with this process, okay, with oogenesis? Okay. Okay, that's what's going on inside the ovaries. Okay. So that's the ovaries. Okay. Now, once that oocyte gets released into the ovaries, it's now going to enter the uterine tubes, or also called the fallopian tubes. Okay. So if you remember, this is going to be the site where fertilization will be taking place. Okay. So these fallopian tubes are going to be these tubes that are going to extend laterally from the uterus, okay, and they're going to connect with the ovaries here. Okay. So the job of the uterus, or the uterine tubes, is to connect the ovaries to the uterus, and basically transport the secondary oocyte or the fertilized ovum, depending on what has happened here, transport that to the uterus, and eventually help that implanted embryo, or the embryo, to implant inside the uterus here. Okay. It's just going to be a transport channel here. Okay. Now, at the top of the fallopian tubes, or the uterine tubes, there's going to be a region called the infundibulum. Okay. So this infundibulum is going to be this rounded, kind of funnel-shaped portion here, and it's going to end in a region where we see some fimbriae. Okay. So the fimbriae are these finger-like projections here, and they're mostly going to be kind of flaring out, but there is going to be one fimbria that is going to be attached to the ovary, which we see a little bit easier over here. Okay. So when the oocyte gets released from the ovary, it's eventually going to get released into the peritoneal cavity, and then the fimbria are going to sweep it up into the fallopian tubes from there. Okay. And then it's going to be able to make its way along the fallopian tubes and into the uterus there. Okay, so when we take a look at the uterine tubes, or the fallopian tubes, there's going to be three layers to it. There are three kind of tissue regions here. The first innermost layer is going to be the mucosa. And so inside the mucosa, we're going to have lots of epithelial cells that have lots of cilia. Okay, so the cilia are going to be what helps to transport the oocytes along the fallopian tubes as they kind of sweep back and forth. Okay, so those are going to be the ciliated epithelium there. There's also going to be some non-ciliated PEG cells. Okay? And so what the PEG cells will do is they're going to have lots of microvilli that are going to be able to secrete lots of nutrients to the ovum. Okay? So because the microvilli allow extra surface area, that's going to maximize the amount of nutrients that the PEG cells will be able to deliver to the ovum that is passing through the fallopian tubes. So all that's going to be found inside the mucosa. Okay? In addition to that, there's also going to be a muscularis. And so the muscularis is going to be able to undergo peristalsis. And so peristalsis will help to push the oocyte and propel it, again, towards the uterus. And then the outer region is going to be the serosa. Okay, nothing special with that. Okay. Okay. As we know, fertilization is going to be taking place inside the uterine tubes. Okay, not going to be taking place inside the uterus. It's not going to be taking place inside the ovaries. Fertilization happens specifically inside the uterine tubes, inside the fallopian tubes. Okay, and so fertilization can take place anywhere in the time period up to 24 hours up to ovulation, or sorry, 24 hours after ovulation. Okay. After that 24-hour window after ovulation has occurred, okay, fertilization most likely was not going to be taking place. Okay. And so if fertilization does occur, okay, we're going to end up creating a zygote. Okay? And that zygote will then kind of undergo mitosis and start replicating its cells, and eventually it will make its way down into the uterus. Okay? And so typically the zygote will hit the uterus at about a week after ovulation took place. Okay, so that's that. Okay. Any questions on the uterine tubes or the fallopian tubes?
No.
Okay. All right. So now the next region, the next kind of organ that we're going to take a look at here is the uterus. Okay. And so the uterus is going to kind of serve a multitude of different functions. Okay. Number one is it's going to be kind of a passageway or a pathway that the sperm has to take in order to get into the fallopian tubes. Okay. So that sperm is going to get deposited here inside the vagina. Okay. And then from there, it needs to make its way up through the uterus. Okay. And then eventually into the fallopian tubes. Okay. So the sperm actually has a very long distance that it has to cover in order for fertilization to take place. It has to travel, you know, almost like its equivalent of like miles and miles and miles in order to actually reach the oocytes, okay, inside the fallopian tubes. Okay, that's number one. Number two is the uterus is also going to be the site where the blastocyst, or the kind of the zygote that has undergone mitosis already, that's going to be where the blastocyst is going to implant in. Okay. And specifically, it's going to implant inside the endometrium, and we'll talk about that in a second. Okay. In addition, it's also going to be the place where that blastocyst is going to be able to grow and develop into a fetus. And then that's going to be the place where it kind of grows and develops during the pregnancy. And then labor is also going to be taking place specifically inside the uterus as well. The last function is it's going to be the location or the source of the menstrual flow. Okay. So when menstruation takes place, the uterus is going to be the part that is actually getting shed during menstruation. Okay. And this is going to happen only when implantation of the embryo has not occurred. Okay, so that's the uterus. And so we will kind of look more specifically at that last function at the end of today. Okay. When we take a look at the uterus, there's going to be a few different divisions and different components to it. The first one is called the fundus. And so the fundus is going to be this kind of dome-shaped, kind of superior portion of the uterus. And that is going to make contact with the uterine tubes here. Okay. Then we have the body, which makes up the majority of the uterus. Then we have the cervix, which is going to be this opening here that's going to open into the vagina. Okay, this kind of more inferior opening. Now the next part is called the uterine cavity. That's just the interior portion of the body. That's going to be the space or the lumen of the uterus, and that's going to be where the embryo is eventually, or the fetus is eventually going to be growing into. Okay. And so the next portions are going to be parts of the cervical canal. Okay. The cervical canal is going to have two kind of openings to it. Okay, the first opening is going to be referred to as the external os, or the internal os. The internal os is where the cervix opens up into the uterus. Okay. The other side of the cervical canal is the external os. Okay. And so the external os will open up into the vagina. Okay. So those are the two openings of the cervical canal. The external os kind of going towards the vagina, the internal os going up towards the uterus. Okay. So the way you can kind of remember that is the external os is going to be more oriented towards the exterior of the body, okay, towards the vagina. The internal os is going to be more oriented internally towards the uterus. Okay, so those are the portions of the uterus there. Okay. Now, in addition to that, there's going to be 3 layers of tissue that make up the uterus. Okay, the first one is called the perimetrium. And so the perimetrium is the outer portion of the endometrium. That is going to, of the uterus. And that's going to be made up of epithelial and connective tissue. That's just going to be the outside portion of it. Okay. Then deep to the perimetrium, we're going to have the myometrium. Okay, this myometrium is going to be made up of smooth muscle. Okay, so because we have because the smooth muscle is going to be present inside the myometrium, that smooth muscle is going to be able to respond to oxytocin. And when it responds to oxytocin, that is going to cause contractions here that are going to lead to the expulsion of the baby out of the uterus, okay, during labor, okay, when mom is ready to have her baby. Okay. That's going to be where these contractions are going to be taking place during labor. Okay. In addition to that, these are also the muscles that are responsible for the cramps that women get during the menstrual cycle as well. Those are the coordinated contractions there. Okay. And then the last region of the uterus is the endometrium, and that is the inner lining of the uterus, and it's going to have lots of blood vessels present. Okay. So there's going to be 2 layers to the endometrium. Excuse me. The first layer is called the stratum functionalis. The stratum functionalis is going to be the layer that's more oriented towards the uterine lining. Okay. And that's the part that gets shed, okay, during menstruation. Okay. The deeper layer of the endometrium is called the stratum basalis. That one doesn't get shed. That one is permanent, and it just kind of produces the stratum functionalis kind of coming on top of it. Okay. So this is what it looks like here. So here, if you were to have the lumen of your uterus, the uterine cavity up here, you would first have the stratum functionalis, okay, of the endometrium. Okay, that's the part that's going to get shed during menstruation. Okay. And then deeper to that, you'd have the stratum basalis. Okay, so the stratum basalis here, that is going to be the part that's going to be more permanent, and that is going to be what gives rise to the new stratum functionalis, after menstruation has completed. Okay. Any questions so far on these parts of the uterus?
No.
Okay. Okay. So the uterus is going to have some cells in there, specifically inside the mucosa, that are able to produce a substance called cervical mucus. Okay. And so this cervical mucus, I'll kind of go a little bit out of order on this slide. But the cervical mucus, during any time outside of the ovulation period, okay, anytime outside of ovulation, that cervical mucus is going to be very viscous and very thick. Okay. And so it's essentially going to form a plug inside the cervix and prevent the sperm from passing through the cervix and into the uterus. Okay. So it's going to basically impede the sperm's entry into the uterus. And that's going to happen anytime outside of ovulation. Okay. And so for that reason, for people who have intercourse, outside of ovulation, the likelihood of having a baby is going to be pretty low, because the sperm is not going to have a way to get into the uterus, okay, because it can't get past the cervix. If it can't get past the cervix, it can't get into the uterus. If it can't get into the uterus, it can't get into the fallopian tubes. Okay. So no sperm cells are going to be able to pass through there. Okay. Okay. Now, during the ovulation period, what is more important here, one thing I forgot to mention also, is that also outside of the ovulation period, the cervical mucus is also pretty acidic. Okay. So any sperm that do come in contact with it are pretty much going to die because of the acidity of the mucus. Okay. However, during the ovulation time, the cervical mucus kind of shifts its kind of structure. Okay. And so instead of being so viscous and thick, it becomes a lot thinner and a lot less viscous. And so it's going to be a little bit easier for the sperm to make its way through the cervical mucus. Okay. In addition to that, the cervical mucus is also going to become more alkaline. So it's going to have a pH of about 8.5. So it's not going to be nearly as acidic as it would be, any other time during the cycle. And so because that alkaline, or the mucus becomes more alkaline, it creates a more favorable, more hospitable environment for the sperm. Okay. And so the sperm is going to be able to pass through the cervical mucus, make its way into the uterus, and then again make its way into the fallopian tubes to again hopefully allow fertilization to occur. Okay. Does that part make sense so far?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So that cervical mucus is going to kind of provide a couple different functions for the sperm. Number one is it's going to be able to supply a little bit of energy for the sperm, again, specifically during the ovulation period. It supply lots of energy for the sperm and give it kind of the extra juice it needs to get through the uterus. Okay. Number two is it's going to be able to protect the sperm. Okay. And so as the sperm kind of penetrates through the cervical mucus is also going to kind of coat the sperm as well. And so the female reproductive system and the phagocytes that are in there are going to start to kind of be aware and say, hey, there's something foreign that wasn't here before. Okay. And so naturally, the immune system is going to want to destroy the sperm cells. Okay. So what the cervical mucus does is by kind of coating the sperm, it basically protects the sperm from being exposed to any of those kind of immune functions, any of those phagocytes and anything like that. Okay. So it's going to kind of protect it from the woman's kind of immune system inside the reproductive tract. Okay. The third thing that's going to happen is the cervical mucus helps with the capacitation process. Okay. And so if you remember, capacitation is the process that a sperm has to go through in order to make sure that it's able to actually fertilize the secondary oocyte. Okay. So all three of these are going to be really important functions that the cervical mucus is going to do to help the sperm's process here. Okay, so that's what's going on there. Okay. The next part of the reproductive tract is the vagina. Okay, and so the vagina is going to be a very long canal that's going to be made up of some muscle here, and so it's going to extend from the cervix all the way down to the exterior of the body. Okay. And so it's going to sit posterior to the bladder and posterior to the urethra as well. And so this is kind of where we start to see that the reproductive tract and the urinary tract do not have any kind of similarities, do not have any things in common, like it did with the male reproductive tract. Okay. So these are going to be two different tracts here. The vagina is going to be posterior to the urinary system, basically, but it's also going to be sitting anterior to the rectum. Okay. So that's going to be this structure, this very long canal here. Okay. And so the vagina is going to be important because it's going to serve a number of different functions. Number one, it's going to be the receiving portion that's going to receive the penis during intercourse. It's going to be the region where the menstrual flow is going to flow out of the body from. Okay. And then it's also going to be the passageway for childbirth. Okay. And all those processes are going to be taking place within the vagina, within the vagina here. Okay, so that's that. Okay. So the vagina is going to have a mucosa region, and so that mucosa is going to be producing lots of glycogen, and that glycogen eventually is going to break down into some organic acids. And the acids that break down, or the acids that get formed from this process, help to inhibit any microbial growth. So any bacteria that shouldn't be there, that shouldn't be inside the vagina, are going to be destroyed by the acidic environment that get produced by this glycogen here. Okay. So it's able to protect from any foreign bacteria. However, this is also going to be a little bit harmful to the sperm. Okay, remember, the sperm are going to be very sensitive to acidic environments. Okay. So it's kind of a double-edged sword here in the course in kind of the context of trying to make a baby. Okay. That's going to be in the mucosa region. There's also going to be a muscularis region. Okay. And so the muscularis is going to be made up of mostly smooth muscle, and that smooth muscle is going to be able to expand and dilate. And as it expands and stretches, it's going to be able to accommodate, the penis coming in, as well as, a baby that may be coming out. Okay. All right, so that's the vagina. Okay. Any questions on the vagina? Okay, cool. All right, so the next one is the vulva. Okay, so the vulva is the external genitals for the female. Okay, so this is going to be this kind of outer portion of the reproductive tract here. Okay, so the vulva is made up of four major parts. The first one is the mons pubis. Okay, and so the mons pubis is this kind of elevation, this kind of more rounded kind of elevation above the, or anterior to the vagina and the urethral openings here. And so the mons pubis is made up of mostly adipose tissue. Okay? So because it's made up of mostly fat, it's going to have the ability to protect the pubic symphysis that sits beneath it. Okay? And in addition to that, the mons pubis is also going to be covered with skin as well as some pubic hair. Okay? So that's going to be this region over here. Okay? So mostly adipose tissue. Okay? The next region is the labia majora. And so the labia majora are these two outer folds of skin on either side of the vulva here. Okay. And so the labia majora is going to be covered up by some pubic hair. And then it's also going to kind of extend kind of laterally, okay, and inferiorly, and a little bit posteriorly as well. Okay. So these are the two outer larger pieces of kind of flaps of skin here. And so there's going to be lots of pubic hair here. It's also going to be containing lots of adipose tissue, some oil glands, and some sweat glands, all being produced inside the labia majora, okay, which are the outer kind of lips of the vulva. Okay. And then the third region is the labia minora. Okay, so the labia minora are these kind of more medial folds that are more medial to the labia majora. Okay, that's going to be these regions here. And so the labia minora is a little bit different from the labia majora in that it does not contain any pubic hair, no fat. There's going to be very few sweat glands, but there is going to be a lot of oil glands. Okay? And so what these oil glands are going to do is they're going to create a little bit of lubrication that's going to be present during sexual intercourse. And the last region is the clitoris. So the clitoris is this small little piece of erectile tissue. And so this erectile tissue is going to be a little anterior to the labia minora. And this is basically just going to be involved with sexual excitement. Okay? And so it gets covered up by the labia minora at a region called the prepuce. Okay. All right, so that's the vulva. All right, and the last region, or kind of the last major portion of the reproductive tract that we don't normally think of as part of the reproductive tract are the mammary glands. Okay? And so the mammary glands are going to be found inside the woman's breasts. And so the breasts are going to be anterior to the pectoralis major muscles, and they're going to be made up of mostly connective tissue, mostly adipose tissue. Okay? So these would be the breasts here. And then as we'll see, we're going to see some nipples. And so the nipple is going to be a location where there's going to be some very closely spaced lactiferous ducts. So these are the ducts where the milk is going to exit out of the nipples from. That's going to be where the milk ejection is going to be taking place from. Okay? So inside the nipple, you're going to have lots of those openings of the lactiferous ducts, and that is going to be where milk is going to eject from the nipples from. Okay. All right, that's that. Okay. Now, surrounding the nipple is going to be this pigmented area called the areola. Okay? And so the areola has lots of modified oil glands as well, modified sebaceous glands. Okay. Now, in addition to that, we're also going to have some suspensory ligaments. And so the suspensory ligaments are these pieces of connective tissue, these very long strands of connective tissue that will basically support the breast to kind of hold them up. Okay. And so they lie in between the skin and the fascia of the breast. And again, they just kind of help to support the breast here. Okay. As women tend to get older, these suspensory ligaments tend to kind of loosen up, and that causes the breast to kind of hang down a little bit too. Okay. So that's that there. Okay, then we get to the mammary glands. Okay. And so the mammary glands are actually modified sweat glands. Okay. And so these modified sweat glands, or mammary glands, are going to be the structures that produce the milk. Okay. Those mammary glands are going to be divided up into about 15 to 20 different lobes that are going to be separated by different amounts of adipose tissue. Okay. And every woman's going to have different amounts of adipose tissue inside the breast, which leads to different breast sizes. Okay. And so the different level or different amounts of adipose tissue are going to separate the lobes of the mammary glands. And so within each of the lobes is some structures called alveoli. Okay. So these alveoli are going to be these milk secreting glands inside the breast here. Okay. And so in order to move the milk from the alveoli out of the alveoli, okay, there's going to be some cells called myoepithelial cells. Okay? And so myoepithelial cells are kind of like little muscular cells, and when they contract, they squeeze the milk and kind of propel it through these series of ducts and eventually towards the nipples here. Okay, and so to trace the pathway of the milk flow, it's going to be moving from the alveoli into these secondary tubules. Okay? And then from the secondary tubules, it's going to move into these mammary ducts. Okay? And then once they enter the mammary ducts, they're eventually going to flow into these lactiferous sinuses. Okay? Once it enters the lactiferous sinus, the milk is just going to get stored there until the milk is ready to come out. Okay? Until the milk ejection is ready to occur. Okay? And so when that happens, okay, the milk is going to move from these lactiferous sinuses out through the lactiferous ducts, okay, and then out of the nipple from there. Okay, so this whole process of producing milk to secreting it to ejecting it is referred to as lactation. Okay? And this typically happens only when someone is either pregnant or has just had a baby has just had childbirth. Okay? Okay, so lactation is typically going to be associated with those two processes, pregnancy and childbirth. Okay? Now, lactation is going to be stimulated by a couple hormones, namely by prolactin, which we saw last week. Okay? And then to a lesser degree, it's also going to be stimulated by oxytocin and progesterone. Okay? So those three are going to help with the production of milk. And then in order to eject the milk, Okay, milk ejection is going to be stimulated by the hormone oxytocin. Okay. All right. So that is that. Any questions on the mammary glands?
I have a question for there are programs like I guess wet nurses that help pair parents to donate breast milk to, I guess, moms who can't breastfeed. Is that what is that? Does the breast just produce unlimited amount of milk, not just for their own infant? Or I wasn't sure how that worked.
Yeah. So typically what happens is what they'll do is their bodies are just able to produce kind of just more milk than I guess the average person can. And so as they continue to produce more milk, they just kind of pack it up, package it, and then they just keep producing milk until they're ready to stop. When they stop, they take a few breaks. They take maybe like hour or two breaks, however long they take, and then they just keep going and then produce more milk. So their bodies, because they've been exposed to prolactin either from themselves or from someone kind of in close proximity with them, or oxytocin, they're just able to produce more milk for longer periods of time than kind of like the average or than someone else would. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So with the breast farming procedures, is it the suspensory glands? Is it what they walk on?
So are you talking about for like breast enlargement procedures? Is that what we're talking about?
Is it this breast enlargement and farming? I don't know. It's the same thing.
Yeah. So with breast enlargement procedures, that one gets a little bit more complicated. Sometimes usually what they'll do is they'll just insert some silicone cups inside the breast. So they'll usually put it kind of right in between the muscle and the mammary glands. And so the mammary glands they're not getting affected by this. They're just something kind of behind it in between the muscle and the mammary glands. But the suspensory ligaments typically are not really affected. If anything, because the mammary glands may get pushed a little bit further out because of the extra silicone, the suspensory ligaments might pull a little bit tighter, and that kind of helps to, again, kind of support the breast and kind of pull them up further too. Good question. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
Yes, it did.
Okay, cool. Any other questions here?
No.
Okay, cool. All right, so question here. So in the figure shown, which structure is indicated? We're looking at the fundus, the body, the cervix, the isthmus, or the vagina.
The cervix.
What are we looking at here? Your cervix?
Cervix.
What do we? Yes, absolutely. So this would be the cervix. Okay, good. Okay, so that's going to lead us into the last thing we're going to talk about today, which is the female reproductive cycle. Okay. So before we go forward, are there any questions on anything with the reproductive anatomy for the female first?
No.
Any questions so far? No.
No.
Okay. All right, so the last thing we're going to talk about is the female reproductive cycle. Okay, and so this cycle is typically on average about 28 days in length here. And so depending on the woman, it can range anywhere from 21 to 35 days. But for the sake of our lecture, we're going to just kind of talk about it as a 28-day cycle. Okay. And so this is going to encompass a series of changes inside. Sorry, my nephew's a little antsy. We have a series of events that are going to be taking place inside the ovaries and inside the uterus, and that are going to be occurring throughout the course of this 28-day period, okay, throughout this month. Okay. And so this is going to encompass, a bunch of events that are happening both inside the ovaries as well as inside the uterus. Okay. And so this is typically what's going to be happening in non-pregnant females. Okay. In pregnant females, we're going to see how this changes a little bit, and we're going to kind of see what kind of actions come into play. Okay. Now, this whole female reproductive cycle is going to be regulated by a bunch of hormones. Okay. These hormones are going to be coming from the hypothalamus, from the anterior pituitary, and from the ovaries. Okay? So all of these hormones that get released from these different areas are going to regulate this entire cycle. And this is kind of going back to Sharon's question to kind of see where the disconnect between different hormones can impact the entirety of the reproductive cycle. Okay. So we're going to start here and kind of look at this whole cycle, from a large scale perspective. And so the whole female reproductive cycle, like I said, is going to take into consideration the ovarian cycle. Okay. That's going to be one subcycle of this. And the ovarian cycle is going to encompass all the events that are going to take place during the ovaries maturation process and the oocytes maturation process. Okay. And the other subcycle is the uterine cycle or the menstrual cycle. Okay. And that's going to be all the events that take place within the endometrium of the uterus. Okay. And this is going to be done kind of in preparation for an embryo to implant within the uterus. Okay. And again, both of these cycles are going to be regulated by some hormones. Okay. So the hormones here are going to be really key here. So if you remember going back to last Monday when we were looking at the endocrine system, when we were looking at, in order to activate the anterior pituitary, we need to secrete some releasing hormones. Okay. Does anyone remember that from last week? Okay. These releasing hormones got to get released from the hypothalamus. Okay. One of those releasing hormones is called gonadotropin releasing hormone, or GnRH. Okay. So gonadotropin releasing hormone, GnRH, is a hormone that gets released from the hypothalamus, okay, and it makes its way into the anterior pituitary. Okay. Once it enters the anterior pituitary, it's going to start regulating the reproductive cycle, particularly by stimulating the release of FSH and LH, okay, follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Okay. So when GnRH stimulates the production of FSH and LH, okay, from the anterior pituitary, that is going to stimulate follicular growth inside the ovaries. Okay. And then eventually it's going to lead to a surge of LH. Okay. So this LH surge is going to happen during ovulation, okay, or right before ovulation, I should say. Okay. That surge in your LH production is going to trigger ovulation, and that will ultimately lead to the release of the oocyte, and then the LH will then be able to kind of maintain the corpus luteum to allow it to be able to produce progesterone and estrogen and relaxin and inhibin. Okay. So we're going to take this cycle kind of one piece at a time, and we're going to kind of look at what's happening both within the ovaries and the uterus at different segments. Okay. So we're going to start by looking at the menstrual phase. Okay. So the menstrual phase is going to be this first phase that typically happens from day 1 to about day 5-ish of the woman's reproductive cycle. Okay. And so what's going to be happening is FSH, or follicle stimulating hormone, is going to get produced, okay, from the anterior pituitary. Okay. So GnRH from the hypothalamus is going to trigger the release of FSH from the anterior pituitary. And what follicle stimulating hormone is, it's going to stimulate these follicles, okay, to undergo their development. Okay. So the primordial follicles will develop into primary follicles, and one of these primary follicles is going to be the one that matures to become the secondary follicle. Okay. So that's what we see here. So we have this secondary follicle here. And again, this is all going to be stimulated by FSH, okay, follicle stimulating hormone. Okay. Now, at the same time that's happening, the uterus is going to be menstruating. Okay. So specifically the stratum functionalis of the endometrium is going to be shedding here. And the reason for this is going to be due to declining estrogen and progesterone levels. Okay. When those levels drop, that is going to cause menstruation to take place. Okay. And when you have menstrual flow, you're going to have lots of some blood. You're going to have some endometrial tissue, specifically the tissue from the stratum functionalis, and then some epithelial tissue, all getting shed and exiting out of the uterus and eventually through the vagina, and then go from there. Okay. Now, the reason for this is because some of the blood vessels inside the stratum basale, or sorry, the stratum basalis here, are going to get, or their blood vessels are going to start getting choked off. Okay. And so when those blood vessels rupture, they're no longer going to have access to oxygen, and those stratum functionalis cells are now going to just flake off and then become part of the menstrual flow. Okay. So that's what's happening here during the menstrual phase. Okay. Any questions on this phase here? Okay.
No.
So again, we have low estrogen and progesterone levels, because there's low estrogen and progesterone levels, the menstruation begins to take place, and the stratum functionalis begins to shed because there's no oxygen available because all of these blood vessels are getting ruptured and destroyed.
So, George, FSH is the only hormone being released, and no other one for this menstrual phase?
Yes. For the menstrual phase, it's just FSH getting released here.
Okay.
No other hormone is at play. Yeah. Okay. So that's the menstrual phase. Okay. Then that's going to lead us into the pre-ovulatory phase. Okay. So the pre-ovulatory phase is going to be this phase in between the end of menstruation and ovulation. Okay. That gap of time between menstruation and ovulation, that's going to be what we're talking about here with the pre-ovulatory phase. Okay. So the pre-ovulatory phase is going to have the ovarian follicular phase here. Okay. And so during the follicular phase, what's going to take place is we're going to continue releasing FSH. Okay. And so FSH continues to, sorry, let me backtrack. So FSH is going to stimulate these secondary follicles to develop. Once we start forming these secondary follicles will begin producing estrogen. Okay. What estrogen does is it will stop your production, sorry, estrogen and inhibin. Okay. Estrogen and inhibin are going to stop the production of FSH from the anterior pituitary. Okay. So when you start producing estrogen, you're no longer going to be producing any more FSH. Okay. So at this point, we now have a single secondary follicle, and this secondary follicle will eventually mature into a mature follicle or a Graafian follicle. Okay. Once you develop into a Graafian follicle, the Graafian follicle will then start to produce even more estrogen. Okay. Okay. So during the second, well, we have the secondary follicle, we produce more estrogen and more inhibin. Okay. Those two stop you from producing any more FSH, and that stops the excess kind of follicular development. Okay, so you're only stimulating just this one. Okay. And these guys will start producing estrogen. Okay. So when the ovaries start producing, or sorry, when the oocytes start producing, no, sorry, when the ovaries start producing, sorry, brain fart. Once estrogen starts getting produced here, okay, once estrogen starts getting produced, the estrogen is going to start getting, is going to start stimulating the repair of the endometrium. Okay. And so when the endometrium becomes repaired, this is going to be where we have the uterine proliferative phase. This is going to be where the uterine starts to repair itself. And we start to form new stratum functionalis. Okay. So we have new stratum functionalis here. And so the endometrial thickness is going to begin to double at this point. Okay. Okay, so that's the pre-ovulatory phase. Okay. Secondary follicle continues to get stimulated by FSH. It will start producing estrogen, and so the estrogen will stop the production of FSH. Okay. From there, the secondary follicle will then develop into a mature follicle and continue producing estrogen. And from there, that estrogen will then help with the repair of the endometrium, okay, of the stratum functionalis. Okay. Okay. Questions on the pre-ovulatory phase?
No.
No? Okay. So then the next phase is ovulation. Okay. So to kind of recap before, ovulation is just the rupture of the mature follicle. Okay. So the mature follicle is going to rupture, and when it ruptures, it's going to release that secondary oocyte, and this is typically going to happen on day 14 of this cycle. Okay. So in order for ovulation to take place, again, just to kind of recap, the primary oocyte is going to complete meiosis 1, okay, to become a secondary oocyte. Once we have that secondary oocyte, it's going to then begin meiosis 2, but it's going to halt again, okay, until it gets fertilized. Okay. Once it completes meiosis 2, and once we form the secondary oocyte is, or sorry, once it begins meiosis 2, it's going to get released from the mature follicle into the fallopian tubes. Okay. And again, this is going to be triggered by a surge in the LH production. Okay. So LH gets produced kind of towards the end of the pre-ovulatory phase, but it spikes a lot at the ovulation phase. Okay. Okay, so that's ovulation. Okay, we have an LH surge. The LH surge triggers the release of the secondary oocyte from the mature follicle. Okay. All right, then the last phase here is the post-ovulatory phase, and this is the time period in between ovulation and the next menstrual cycle, the next menstruation process, the next menses. Okay. So this is going to kind of happen in one of two scenarios. Okay. What's going to happen here is we're going to have the ovarian luteal phase. Okay. And so during the luteal phase, what's going to happen is the Graafian follicle is going to collapse in on itself, and when it collapses in, it's going to form the corpus luteum, okay, which we see here. Okay. So here's our corpus luteum, and the corpus luteum is going to stay alive for about 2 weeks. Okay. As long as there is LH production, okay, from the anterior pituitary, the LH production, luteinizing hormone, is going to keep the corpus luteum alive, okay, for about 2 weeks. Okay. LH only lasts for about 2 weeks. Okay. During that 2-week period, the corpus luteum is going to be producing both progesterone and estrogen. Okay. So throughout the cycle, we've been producing estrogen since the pre-ovulatory phase. Okay. But now here at the post-ovulatory phase, we now have progesterone also being formed here. Okay. And so what progesterone does is it's going to help to stimulate extra repair of the endometrial lining. Okay. And so when we think of progesterone, I'll kind of write this out here because this helped me remember it too. Progesterone kind of equals progestation. Okay, gestation means birth. Okay, so it's going to be in favor of allowing kind of a baby to be implanted here. Okay, so. Progesterone is going to be important because this is going to allow the endometrial lining to thicken even further. And so, again, in preparation for an embryo that will be implanting within the next 7 days of this cycle. Okay. So, corpus luteum produces progesterone and estrogen to kind of thicken the endometrial lining. Okay. Now, one of two things is going to happen at this point. Okay. If the oocyte does not get fertilized, this is scenario one. Scenario one is the oocyte does not get fertilized. Okay. If the oocyte does not get fertilized, LH production stops after this 2-week period. Once LH production stops, the corpus luteum dies, and then we no longer produce any more progesterone and estrogen. Once the progesterone and estrogen kind of gets limited here, and once we no longer produce any more progesterone and estrogen, that is going to lead into the next menstrual cycle inside the uterine phase. Okay. And so that is going to unlock the GnRH, FSH, and LH production and allow those to kind of spike back up, okay, to begin this whole process all over again for the next cycle. Okay. And so like I said, during this process here, progesterone and estrogen kind of help to increase the thickness of the endometrial lining. However, at the end of this phase, okay, what's going to happen when we no longer have any more progesterone and estrogen is that is going to lead into the next menstrual cycle. Okay, because that's going to happen assuming the oocyte does not get fertilized. Okay, oocyte does not get fertilized, LH production stops. Once LH production stops, you no longer have the corpus luteum, progesterone and estrogen levels drop, and then you start the next menstrual cycle.
And that's scenario one.
That's scenario one.
Okay.
Yes. That's if the oocyte does not get fertilized.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Any questions on this scenario?
No.
No.
Okay. The second scenario is what happens if the oocyte does get fertilized. Okay. So if the oocyte does get fertilized, then what's going to happen is the corpus luteum is going to last for longer than 2 weeks. Okay. Now, what's going to happen here is LH is still going to run out after that 2-week period. Okay. LH is only going to be produced for 2 weeks. Okay. After that 2-week period, the embryo is going to start producing human chorionic gonadotropin, or HCG. Okay. HCG starts to mimic what LH does. Okay. And so HCG basically takes over for LH and keeps the corpus luteum alive. Okay. And as it keeps the corpus luteum alive, the corpus luteum is able to continue producing progesterone and estrogen. And by continuing to produce progesterone and estrogen, we keep the endometrial lining thick. Okay? And that is going to be really important because if an embryo implants, we need the endometrial lining to be thick. Okay, that's kind of where that progestation becomes important. Okay, progesterone in terms of helping with the birth process here, or kind of the implant process. Okay, okay, so the HCG keeps the corpus luteum alive. As long as the corpus luteum stays alive, we continue to produce progesterone and estrogen. Okay. And so that is going to kind of be the ovarian part. That's the luteal phase. That is going to impact the endometrium by maintaining the thickness of the endometrial lining, maintaining the growth of the endometrium and keeping it nice and thick for implantation. Okay. If there was a scenario where the HCG wasn't doing its job, or something happened where progesterone and estrogen were not being produced anymore, okay, then that would cause menstruation to take place, and any embryo that is already implanted will then be shed during the next menstruation. So we don't want that to happen. So the HCG helps to maintain the corpus luteum and help it keep it alive, so it continues to produce progesterone and estrogen.
And that's what Sharon was asking you, if you have complications with the LH or the LH, right? It wouldn't.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that goes back to Sharon's question earlier. So if there's a problem with FSH, right? So we can kind of take this from multiple different angles. So if there's a problem with, let's just take it from GnRH. Okay. If there's a problem with GnRH and you're not going to be able to produce any FSH or LH to begin with, and if you cannot do any of this, you're not going to have any of this cycle take place at all. Okay. You're not going to have ovulation. You're not going to have the follicular development. You're not going to have progesterone and estrogen. None of that's going to happen. Okay. So GnRH is kind of the main guy that kind of helps this whole, that kind of sets the stage for everything else. Okay. If there's a problem with FSH, then you're not going to be developing any of the follicles. If none of the follicles develop, then you never get ovulate, or then you never kind of get the mature follicle developing. Okay, so that doesn't happen. Okay, if you have a problem with LH, okay, if you're not able to produce any LH, you're not going to have ovulation take place. So you can develop all the follicles you want. Okay, but if you don't have that surge in your LH production, you're never going to have ovulation. You're never going to release an oocyte. Okay, if there's a problem with estrogen or progesterone, okay, then you're just basically not going to have a thick enough endometrium to sustain any pregnancy. Okay, so there's multiple different areas where this whole thing can go wrong in very kind of out there scenarios, kind of like what scenario the scenario that Sharon had brought up earlier. Okay, so if there's a disconnect in any one of those hormones, it can create a significant problem in terms of being able to have kids, or a significant problem with the reproductive cycle as a whole. Okay, does that make sense?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, cool. That was a very, very good question. I'm glad you brought that up. Cool. Any other questions here? Okay. So this is a very complicated. Oh yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, in just addition to that, I have a friend who told me that she was told to cut her body weight. She's been struggling with conception. So can the body weight affect someone's too? Or?
Yes. Yeah. And so her question was, can body weight affect hormones? And so a lot of times if someone is dealing with reproductive issues, one of the things that like an OBGYN might recommend is to try to lose weight. And so losing weight and I'm not sure if it's well kind of figured out, but there are some hormones that tend to be more either more active or less active if you're carrying a little bit extra weight. And so one of the things that you can do is to kind of cut your weight. And so for people who lose weight, it helps to kind of reset the whole reproductive cycle and help to make sure that all those hormones are getting released at the appropriate times. Why that's the case, I'm not entirely sure. I think it's a bunch of like hormones that have to do with like the amount of adipose tissue levels and a bunch of other things. They start to interfere with one another. I believe that's what it is, but I'm not entirely positive. But basically what the biggest thing here is that when people lose weight, it tends to kind of help all these hormones kind of reset and then begin to get released at the appropriate times, and then kind of put your reproductive cycle back on track. Yeah, very good question. Any other questions here?
No.
No? Okay, cool. Okay, So this is just a larger picture for the reproductive cycle. So this is going to be a big one that will show up on the final two. So I would be comfortable with all of the different stages of the reproductive cycle. To study this, what I would do is I would try to draw everything out and be able to explain what's happening at each individual phase. Okay, draw out what's happening at the menstrual phase and explain what's happening with the different hormones and what's happening in the ovaries and what's happening with the uterus. Okay. Do the same thing with the pre-ovulatory phase. What's happening there with the hormones, ovaries, uterus. Ovulation, hormones, ovaries, uterus. Post-ovulatory phase, hormones, ovaries, uterus. Okay. The other thing to keep in mind here is that everything is kind of connected here. Okay. So what's going to happen here is the hypothalamus is going to be kind of signaling the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary is going to be signaling the release of hormones from the follicles or from the corpus luteum. And the corpus luteum or the follicles are going to be impacting what's happening inside the uterus. Okay. So they're all connected to one another. Okay. So as you start to study, be comfortable with what's happening at all of those individual stages. Okay, so that's that. So we are kind of towards the end of this. This is a video here. What I will have you guys do is I'll have you guys watch this on your own. It's about a 5-minute video that kind of goes through the reproductive system or the reproductive cycle. And so I would highly recommend watching it because it does kind of go through everything in a more kind of visual, in a more visual manner. So go through that after class today. And again, that'll kind of help with your study. Okay. All right. Last thing here is there is a condition that has to deal with the uterus, and this is a pretty rough condition called endometriosis. Okay. And so endometriosis is a condition where a woman can end up with portions of endometrial tissue, okay, in areas other than the uterus itself. Okay. And so, for example, you might have endometrial tissue that has found its way onto the large intestine, or found its way onto the rectum, or found its way onto the intestines or the kidneys, or things like that. Okay. So you have endometrial tissue growing in non-endometrial places. Okay. And so this one is, no one really knows exactly how this takes place, but one of the leading hypotheses is what's called retrograde menstruation. Okay. And so the idea behind retrograde menstruation is that instead of menstruating out, to the vagina, sometimes the idea is that sometimes menstruation can happen backwards up into the peritoneal cavity and into the abdomen. Okay. And so with retrograde menstruation, you end up with pieces of endometrial tissue getting lodged in your abdomen, along your kidneys, along your intestines, along your colon, along your spleen, and things like that. They get lodged everywhere inside the abdominal cavity. Okay. The problem with this is this endometrial tissue responds the exact same way to those hormones as the actual endometrial tissue inside the endometrium does. Okay. And so when it comes time for the estrogen levels and progesterone levels to drop before the menses process, the menstruation process, okay, those tissues are going to respond the exact same way, and they're going to start bleeding too, okay, just like the endometrial tissue will. Okay? And so when they start bleeding, that creates a lot of inflammation. It creates a lot of pain, a lot of scarring, especially not just on the tissue itself, but on any of the organs that it's found its way to lodge itself onto. Okay? And in some cases, it can lead to infertility as well. So this is a pretty nasty condition that affects women of all ages, and usually, women of the kind of the middle ages. But it is one thing that kind of affects and is a pretty common condition. So in order to kind of treat endometriosis, what surgeons will do is they'll actually go in. Sometimes they'll remove the entire uterus altogether, and that's typically the most effective way. They remove the uterus using a hysterectomy, and then they go in and try to take out as much of the uterine tissue inside the abdominal cavity as they can, to try to limit the amount of bleeding that takes place in response to those hormones. Okay. The problem with this is this kind of forces that woman directly into menopause. So it's kind of a natural condition, and even when you get treated for it, it kind of comes with its own kind of complications too. Okay. Any questions with endometriosis?
No.
Okay, cool. Okay, last question here. So after fertilization and implantation, the corpus luteum secretes which hormones to maintain pregnancy? Okay, so we have HCG, luteinizing hormone, estrogen and progesterone, FSH, or gonadotropin releasing hormone.
Estrogen and
Which one gets released
progesterone.
from the corpus luteum to maintain it? Estrogen and progesterone. Do we agree with that? Do we disagree with that? What are we thinking?
I said C.
C.
Yes. C is, so yeah, the corpus luteum is going to be producing estrogen and progesterone. And remember, progesterone progestation, that's going to help with allowing a pregnancy to take place by thickening the endometrial lining. Okay. And again, that's going to be done in order to kind of prepare the endometrium for an embryo that may be implanting later. Cool. All right, that is it. Any questions on the reproductive system from what we talked about so far?
I have a question real quick, George.
Yes.
It was on, I think it's, I don't know how to pronounce it. It's oogenesis. Is that how you pronounce it?
Oogenesis?
Yeah, I have a question about that. So I don't know what slide it was on, but it was talking about kind of like meiosis too.
Yes. Yeah,
Trying to
oogenesis.
follow- Yeah, I was trying to follow it, and then what happens to the second
Yeah.
polar body during meiosis too?
Mhm.
And that's where I kind of got confused because I know it splits up into the ovium and then the second polar body, but what happens to the second polar body? Does anything happen to it, or?
Oh, no. So the second polar body ends up getting destroyed and degraded.
Oh,
So both of
okay.
the polar bodies here, nothing really comes of those. Those are just kind of discarded material, genetic material. And so they just get kind of thrown away, degraded, destroyed. They don't ever see the light of day. They're done. They're nothing.
Oh, that's what you meant.
The
Okay.
only ones that matter are the secondary oocyte and the ovum itself.
Oh, okay, for sure. All right, and then I have a question about the lab though. I don't know if you got my email or not. It's about the urinary system lab.
Okay.
So for page 3, I think it's
Oh, I haven't seen it yet.
535. Yeah, 535, where we have to draw the diagrams for the urinary system.
Mhm.
Are we going to look at any diagram we see inside the lab itself?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And label their functions as well.
Yeah. Yeah. So for that question, and this was a question a couple people came up with too, and I didn't even notice it when I put it. For that particular question, when it comes to drawing out the urinary system, just draw out what the urinary system would look like. So you can just find a picture from the textbook, or you can find a picture from online, but just draw all the components of the urinary system: the kidneys, the ureters, the bladder, the urethra, and all that.
Okay.
That's all you got to do.
Okay.
Is it 535 or 536?
I think it's
That was 535, I believe it was.
536, actually, yeah.
536. Okay, yeah. So 536.
Okay.
Yeah, 536. So I think it was that first question at the top. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. Any other questions?
No. That's
No, I think that's it.
Okay.
okay.
That was our last
Anything else?
lecture. Holy.
That's our last lecture of the semester.
Okay. Okay. So, if there's nothing else, just got one last thing I want to say. I just want to thank you guys all for a wonderful semester. I enjoyed having all you guys in class. I really just, you guys were a treasure and a treat to have for my last semester here. So I really appreciate you guys being, as awesome as you were and as invested as you were. And you guys should all be proud of you. We made it through 26 chapters in this textbook. And so we went through the entirety of the human anatomy. So you guys should be incredibly proud of yourselves, incredibly happy. It's awesome. So give yourselves a pat on the back, congratulate yourselves for that. A huge congratulations to you guys for accomplishing that. That's a big thing, and this is not an easy class. So props to you guys there. That's number one. Number two is just kind of, as you kind of seen, the human body is just seriously beautifully built. So if there's nothing else you learn from this class, take this away, in that knowing just how beautifully built all of your bodies are. The bodies can do some incredibly awesome things. And so we only get one of them. So, take care of your body. You only get one, make the most of it. And, really, really take care of the body. Because like you said, that's whatever you have is what you got. And that's, you just kind of got to work with, work with that beautiful body you've been given. That's that. Last thing, is there anyone who's graduating this semester that's here right now?
No, I think just Najee.
No.
Najee.
Okay. Well, Nagin's not here, but just want to give a quick shout out to Nagin. Congratulations on graduating. You deserve it. Props to you, and best of luck in the future. For the rest of you guys, like I said, it was just an absolute honor and a treat to have you guys in class. So, like I said, I appreciate you guys so much, and I'm so thankful that I had you guys during my last semester here. So.
And you're gonna